Early Victorian Britain was a swamp of cesspits, corpse-scented rivers, and sludge-filled streets, long before sanitation became fashionable. The air wasn't foggy, it was just aggressively flavoured. If you ever wish to experience what the inside of a sewer might smell like without actually visiting one, congratulations, you are already living there. Let's step into London, circa 1840. Imagine waking up, drawing back your curtains, and being greeted by the perfume of 1,000 unemptied chamber pots. Outside your window, the Thames doesn't sparkle, it bubbles. The cobblestones are slick with mystery liquids best left unidentified. Horses clop by, leaving behind steaming souvenirs that mix with rotting vegetables, animal bones, and whatever fell off a butcher's cart yesterday. In short, the city was an open-air compost bin, and everyone lived in it. The problem wasn't laziness, it was logistics. Cities had grown faster than anyone could invent a decent way to deal with human waste. Sewers barely existed. Trash collection? If by collection you mean thrown out the window at midnight, then yes. Sanitation was a DIY activity, and most Victorians were terrible at it. You'd pay someone known as a night soil man to haul away your waste, but he might decide to dump it in the nearest river instead of taking it to a proper pit, because why travel farther when gravity's already on your side? Hello travellers, histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. Now you might think this was just a problem for the poor. Oh no, even the upper classes weren't safe. The rich had grand homes, chandeliers and fancy dinnerware, but their plumbing was about as reliable as a politician's promise. Waste flowed under the floors, through the walls, and sometimes alarmingly back up again. Your elegant townhouse might literally marinate in its own success. The Victorians loved to talk about refinement, but beneath every parlour rug lay the faint sound of bubbling doom. The irony was that they didn't yet understand how disease worked. Doctors blamed miasma, bad air, for everything from cholera to heartbreak. The logic was simple. If something smelled awful, it must be dangerous. Technically, they weren't wrong about the danger. They were just wrong about the mechanism. It wasn't the smell killing people. It was the microscopic party happening in the water they drank. But since nobody knew about bacteria yet, everyone just waved perfumed handkerchiefs and hoped for the best. Living in early Victorian cities was like participating in an ongoing science experiment, except nobody volunteered, and the control group was already dead. Children played beside open drains, laundry dried above cesspits, and butchers happily tossed blood into the gutter. The Thames was called the Great Sewer, and that wasn't an insult. It was a job description. On a hot day, the river didn't just reek, it radiated. And yet, life went on. People got married, went to work, bought fish from stalls literally beside piles of refuse. Human adaptability is impressive. Give us enough time, and we'll call anything normal. Londoners simply carried on, holding their breath and hoping that they wouldn't have to identify whatever floated by their doorstep. Of course, it wasn't just smell and mess. It was death. Cholera swept through neighbourhoods like a judgment from above. Typhoid, dysentery, tuberculosis, these weren't rare diseases. They were seasonal guests. Poor sanitation meant poor health, but it also meant the city itself was sick. London was expanding faster than its infrastructure could handle, like a teenager eating too much and outgrowing their clothes overnight. To make matters worse, politics slowed progress. Reformers begged for better drainage and waste systems, but Parliament wasn't eager to spend money on something as unglamorous as sewers. It would take years and an absolutely catastrophic stench before the government finally decided to act. Until then, the city endured its filth with British stoicism and an alarming tolerance for the unsanitary. If you think about it, early Victorian Britain was living proof that civilization doesn't always smell civilized. Beneath the carriages and corsets was a festering ecosystem that no amount of lavender could mask. But this was also the beginning of a revolution, because from this filth, reform would rise. The Victorians didn't just survive the stench, they turned it into science, engineering, and ultimately salvation. The good news, change was coming. The bad news, it involved digging up everything that smelled. From London to Manchester, the urban stench was universal, making life a nasal endurance test for rich and poor alike. Perfume sales soared because breathing was a full contact sport. If you've ever caught a whiff of something so awful it made your soul briefly leave your body, then congratulations, you've had a small taste of Victorian Britain's daily atmosphere. Every major city smelled like it was losing an invisible war against its own biology. The air wasn't just thick, it was alive. Breathing in a Victorian city wasn't just respiration, it was participation. Let's start with London, the beating, belching heart of the empire. The Thames, which should have been a river, had transformed into a slow-moving soup of refuse, industrial runoff and human waste. Factories poured in chemicals, tanneries dumped acids, and households emptied chamber pots directly into tributaries. The result was a cocktail so potent that it could peel paint, and possibly your sense of hope. On hot days, the stench was so overwhelming that even the hardiest Londoner was tempted to evolve gills just to escape the air. But London had competition. Manchester, industrial pride of the north, smelled like success had been left out too long. Coal smoke blanketed the city in a permanent haze, mixing with the sweet rot of refuse and the iron tang of factory runoff. People joke that you didn't need to light a match to see the smog glow. In Liverpool, docks festered with spoiled fish and leaking oil, while in Birmingham the canals were said to bubble on their own, a feature that was less picturesque and more chemical hazard. And here's the best part. Everyone had gone nose-blind to it. Letters from visiting foreigners read like horror novels, travellers describing streets that reeked of decay, choked with vapours, or smelled as if the devil himself were boiling laundry. The locals, on the other hand, shrugged and called it the smell of progress. Nothing says optimism like redefining sulphuric fumes as economic growth. Even indoors there was no escape. Parlors and drawing rooms, no matter how elegant, still reeked faintly of damp walls and smoke. Gaslighting filled homes with a sour tang of burnt air, and candles made of animal fat didn't exactly improve things. Kitchens were chemical warfare zones, coal stoves belching soot, grease congealing in corners, and food that sometimes went off faster than you could boil it. If you wanted to breathe clean air, your best bet was a day trip to the countryside, where, conveniently, farmers were busy fertilising fields with the same city waste that had been carted out the night before. The Victorians, for all their civility, were obsessed with odour. Smell wasn't just a nuisance, it was moral panic in the making. The upper classes believed that foul air wasn't just unpleasant, but corrupting, a physical manifestation of sin and moral decay. Entire sermons were preached about cleanliness being next to godliness, though clean often meant doesn't reek like a tannery. Perfume became not merely fashion, but survival. Gentlemen dabbed their moustaches with lavender oil before venturing into the streets, and ladies carried pomanders, little balls of scented herbs, to defend their delicate constitutions against the olfactory onslaught. In wealthier neighbourhoods, households burned incense, vinegar, or even gunpowder to purify rooms. The less fortunate had to make do with opening a window, an act of bravery given what was outside. Middle-class homes had elaborate rituals to disguise household smells, boiling vinegar to cut through smoke, stuffing orange peels in chimneys, or placing bowls of camphor on tables to ward off invisible miasmas. Essentially, the Victorians tried to fight the smell of death with the smell of cleaning supplies. Smell even influenced architecture. Houses sprouted ventilation shafts, air grates, and chimney flues designed less for comfort and more for odour management. The belief was that bad air could seep in through walls, so homes became fortresses of drafty windows and open spaces. Unfortunately, none of these designs addressed the actual issue, that the city itself was one enormous petri dish. The government, naturally, handled the situation with all the urgency of a snail in denial. Reports detailing the unsanitary conditions of cities piled up, each one describing new and creative ways humans were poisoning themselves. Still, change came slowly, because smell, however vile, wasn't enough to spur massive spending. Only when the stench began interfering with the business of empire, when politicians themselves couldn't sit in Parliament without gagging, would they act. Yet amid all this stink, something remarkable happened. Smell became science. Chemists began experimenting with air quality tests. Doctors started correlating odours with outbreaks. Though they still misunderstood the cause, the sheer assault on their noses forced them to start asking why. In that sense, the Victorian stench was both symptom and catalyst, an unpleasant muse that inspired the birth of public health. So yes, the smell of early industrial Britain could make you faint, but it also made history. The cities that reeked the most would eventually lead the way in cleaning them up. The irony is exquisite. The great stink would eventually birth great innovation. The good news, the Victorians finally learned that progress smells terrible before it smells clean. The bad news, it was about to get much worse before it got better. Human waste festered beneath homes, seeping through walls and floors while Victorians dined above their own decay. Your downstairs neighbour wasn't noisy, just decomposing. If there's one thing the Victorians were truly consistent about, it was their ability to ignore the obvious. They loved a good parlour, velvet curtains, piano in the corner, perhaps a roast on the table, and directly beneath all that elegance, a pit of horror. The great paradox of Victorian domestic life was that you could sip tea in the drawing room while, a few feet below, your family's collective digestive achievements were quietly fermenting. These cesspits, or privy vaults as they were politely called, were meant to hold waste until someone, usually a night soil man, came to empty them. In theory, this was a manageable system. In practice, it was a disaster that smelled like revenge. These pits weren't lined properly, rarely sealed, and often located terrifyingly close to wells. Victorian cities were basically built on a foundation of biological booby traps. In many homes, the cesspit sat directly under the kitchen floor or the backyard paving stones. When full, it would overflow into the surrounding soil, sometimes leaking into neighbouring basements. Walls became damp, not from London's fog, but from something far more intimate. In lower-class neighbourhoods, where people packed into narrow houses, the waste from dozens of families could end up pooling beneath a single building. There were cases where floorboards actually warped from the heat of decomposition. Imagine hosting dinner while your floorboards audibly burped. Now, to empty these fragrant chambers, you'd hire the unsung heroes of the underworld, the night soil men. Their job was simple. Descend into the pits after dark, shovel the contents into barrels and cart it away, often barefoot and armed, with little more than a candle and an iron stomach. It was filthy, dangerous work. One wrong step and you'd vanish into a very undignified grave. Yet despite their vital role, these men were treated like social outcasts, shunned in daylight, essential by night. Without them, the cities would have drowned in their own waste within weeks. And where did the waste go after it was collected? Ideally to rural fields as fertiliser. But ideally was a flexible term. Many collectors dumped their loads into rivers, canals, or even the nearest empty lot. Out of sight, out of mind, except of course the stench didn't stay out of mind for long. Entire neighbourhoods were nicknamed stink districts, and landlords pretended not to notice. The wealthy had their own brand of denial. Even the grandest townhouses in London's West End had cesspits discreetly tucked beneath marble floors. Servants were expected to handle any odour emergencies with vinegar, ashes or perfumes, ensuring the lady of the house never learned what horrors lay under her ballroom. Some owners went so far as to seal vents with wax or install decorative grills to redirect the smell elsewhere. It was like living in a mansion that whispered, "I'm beautiful, but I'm rotting inside." And the sounds. Oh, the sounds. Waste pits produced more than odour. They made noises, gurgles, hisses, and the occasional ominous pop. Early indoor plumbing sometimes connected to these pits, creating the delightful phenomenon of backflow. Imagine flushing a primitive toilet only for the contents to bubble back up, not necessarily yours. Indoor convenience was often code for indoor surprise. To make matters worse, Victorian builders had an unfortunate talent for improvisation. When old cesspits overflowed, rather than empty them, they'd just brick them over and dig a new one beside it. Over time, entire layers of forgotten waste accumulated beneath city streets, archaeological strata of human neglect. Centuries later, when modern construction crews dig into Victorian neighbourhoods, they sometimes still find them silent time bombs of methane and microbial ambition. The health consequences were as ghastly as you'd expect. Cesspits turned homes into slow-motion disease factories. Typhoid, dysentery and cholera thrived in the damp, contaminated air. One drop of seepage into a family's water jug could spell disaster. Children were especially vulnerable, and mortality rates in urban centres skyrocketed. Yet many Victorians still resisted reform. Emptying pits cost money, and few landlords cared to spend it. After all, they weren't the ones living above the muck. The irony is that these cesspits were, in their own gruesome way, symbols of progress. They represented a halfway step between open defecation and true sanitation, a literal bridge over troubled water. The Victorians were trying, just not very successfully. They wanted to be modern, to be clean, but lacked the technology and understanding to make it happen. Some reformers, like Edwin Chadwick, began sounding the alarm by mid-century, demanding proper sewers and drainage, but early on his reports were met with ridicule. Who wanted to discuss feces in polite society? It was an impolite truth, one that seeped through the cracks. Quite literally. Only when the stench reached the drawing rooms of Parliament would anyone admit the obvious, that you can't build civilization on a compost heap. Still, there's a perverse kind of admiration due to the Victorians. They endured this situation with astonishing calm. They complained, yes, but they adapted, burning incense, scrubbing walls, and blaming the miasma instead of the bacteria. It was national-scale denial at its finest. If you could visit a Victorian home today, you might marvel at the chandeliers, the wallpaper, the ornate fireplaces, but the real story lies just below your feet. Underneath the lace and civility was a world best left undisturbed, a subterranean reflection of everything society pretended not to see. The good news? They were about to start digging, literally and figuratively. The bad news? They were going to discover just how deep their problems ran. Contaminated pumps spread cholera, while science still thought clear water meant safety. If your water looked clear, you were either lucky or delusional. Victorian water was a mystery beverage, colourless, odourless, and often lethal. To the unsuspecting eye, it looked perfectly fine. To the microscopic world, it was an all-you-can-eat buffet. The Victorians, poor souls, didn't yet know that every sip of refreshing water was potentially signing their own death certificate. They believed that as long as it didn't smell like a sewer, it couldn't be a sewer. Tragically, they were wrong. In early 19th century Britain, the same rivers that powered industry and ferried ships also carried the unmentionable contributions of millions. London's Thames was the worst offender, an aquatic graveyard for everything from animal carcasses to industrial sludge. Entire neighbourhoods drank directly from it. Water companies, privately owned and profit-driven, competed not on cleanliness but on convenience. Convenience, in this case, meant the nearest intake pipe, often just downstream from where someone else was dumping their waste. It was like hosting a dinner party and sourcing the wine from your neighbour's bathtub. Cholera loved this arrangement. It was a microscopic hitchhiker, thriving in contaminated water and travelling faster than gossip through a Victorian parlour. The first major outbreak hit Britain in 1831, and it was catastrophic. People died within hours, perfectly healthy in the morning, corpses by evening. Their bodies twisted with cramps. Their skin turned ashen, and dehydration left them looking like wax figures of themselves. Entire streets fell silent overnight. But here's the kicker. Nobody knew why. The reigning medical theory of the time, miasma, claimed that disease came from bad air. If something smelled foul, it must be the cause of illness. Since cholera victims were often found in foul-smelling places, doctors assumed the air was to blame. No one stopped to think that maybe, just maybe, the problem was what people were drinking. Enter the infamous Broad Street pump, a humble water source in Soho that would become a symbol of scientific revolution. In 1854, when a devastating cholera outbreak struck the area, the brilliant and slightly obsessive John Snow began to investigate. Snow was a man ahead of his time, part detective, part scientist, and entirely unimpressed by bad theories. He suspected that cholera was not airborne at all, but waterborne. To prove it, he did something revolutionary. He made a map. He marked the locations of every cholera death in Soho and noticed they clustered around the Broad Street pump. The pattern was unmistakable. People who lived nearby and drank its water were dying, while those who got water from other sources remained healthy. Snow's next move was bold. He convinced local authorities to remove the pump handle. Within days, the outbreak subsided. The evidence was so clear you could almost drink it, though please don't. But of course, this is the Victorian era, where logic goes to die in committee. Despite Snow's findings, many officials refused to accept his conclusion. Water can't cause disease, they said. It's clean. They believed that if you couldn't see the poison, it wasn't there. To them, clear water was safe water, as though cholera politely wore a name tag. Snow's discovery was largely ignored at first, buried under a pile of academic stubbornness and scented handkerchiefs. Meanwhile, cities beyond London faced their own watery tragedies. In Leeds, people drank from streams that flowed directly through slaughterhouses. In Glasgow, the River Clyde glistened with industrial waste and optimism. In Bristol, wells sat conveniently beside cesspits, ensuring a delightful cross-contamination experience. Across Britain, cholera came and went in waves, each one a grim reminder that you can't build an empire on dysentery. The rich fared only slightly better. They had private water supplies and filters made of sand, charcoal, or even sponge, none of which stopped bacteria. They also liked to mix their water with wine or gin, which arguably helped a little, mostly because they drank less water as a result. The poor, on the other hand, had no such luxury. They fetched water from communal pumps, paying a penny for what was essentially disease in liquid form. In crowded tenements, people shared buckets, cups, and fate. By mid-century, reformers like Edwin Chadwick were campaigning for cleaner water system. His reports were filled with horrifying details: drains emptying into wells, water pipes crossing cesspits, children fetching drinking water from ditches where pigs bathed. He argued that disease could be prevented through sanitation, though ironically Chadwick still believed in miasma, so he wanted to drain everything for the smell, not the microbes. Still, his efforts laid the groundwork for future reform. It would take decades and many more deaths for the link between water and disease to be universally accepted. The discovery of germs by Pasteur and Koch in the late 19th century finally confirmed what Snow had suspected all along. The enemy wasn't the air, but what floated unseen in every drop. With that revelation, the modern public health movement was born. But until then, every glass of water was a gamble. Some people boiled it, others flavoured it with lemon or drank beer instead, which, to be fair, was genuinely safer. Water companies eventually began filtering their supplies, but trust took generations to rebuild. The Victorians dreamed of purity but drank from poison. They washed, cooked, and baptised in it. They toasted to health with glasses filled with death. And yet, from this ignorance came progress, because nothing motivates reform quite like a city collectively realising its water supply is trying to kill it. The good news? Dr. Snow's pump would change the world. The bad news? It took a lot of funerals before anyone believed him. Before germ theory, doctors blamed bad smells for death itself, turning fresh air into a medical cure. According to science, death was just a strong whiff away. For much of the 19th century, Victorian medicine operated under one fragrant assumption. If it smelled bad, it was bad. The miasma theory, the belief that diseases were caused by noxious vapours rising from filth, dominated science, politics, and even architecture. It was the medical equivalent of blaming ghosts for drafty windows. To be fair, it made perfect sense to anyone with a functioning nose. The cities stank, people got sick, and nobody could see bacteria yet. To them, smell wasn't a symptom, it was the suspect. The word miasma itself sounded serious and mysterious, like something you'd shout in a séance. Doctors described it as corrupt air, an invisible fog of death that seeped from rotting matter, corpses, garbage, manure, even damp soil. It could travel through open windows, linger in your clothes, and sneak into your lungs while you slept. And once it got you, there was no telling what ailment it would strike. Cholera, typhoid, fever. The miasma didn't discriminate. It was the Victorian version of the boogeyman, only smellier. Medical men, armed with nothing more than thermometers, intuition, and impressive facial hair, became olfactory detectives. They sniffed out clues like bloodhounds. Hospital wards were reorganised not to separate the sick from the healthy, to separate the smelly from the merely unpleasant. Clean air was the cure for all ills. If you had a fever, you were told to open the windows. If you were dying, they opened the windows for you. Ventilation was medicine. The government even joined the crusade. Reports on public health were filled with poetic descriptions of foul emanations, putrescent vapours, and effluvia of decay. Inspectors roamed the streets with handkerchiefs pressed to their faces, reporting outbreaks of offensive smells as if they were military threats. When Parliament debated sanitation reform, the discussion centred not on germs or contamination, but on odour management. The nation's leaders were, quite literally, legislating by nose. Hospitals became battlegrounds of the miasma myth. Doctors believed that air carrying the smell of the sick could spread their condition, so they built wards with massive windows and high ceilings to let in breezes. Ironically, this design saved lives, not because it chased away bad smells, but because it reduced cross-infection by accident. Meanwhile, surgical rooms reeked of carbolic acid, vinegar, and fear. Surgeons rarely washed their hands between patients, but they did wash the floors because smell. For the poor, the consequences were deadly. Miasma theory didn't just shape medicine, it shaped morality. The upper classes decided that foul air came from foul living, that the working poor, living in slums full of filthy habits, brought disease upon themselves. Poverty became medicalised sin. Reformers preached that cleanliness wasn't just healthy, it was holy. And since bad smells equaled bad morals, sanitation reform became as much about respectability as survival. Enter Florence Nightingale, who waged her own war against miasma. When she arrived at Scutari during the Crimean War, she was horrified by the stench of unwashed bodies and rotting wounds. She ordered the windows thrown open, the floors scrubbed, and the linens boiled. Death rates plummeted, and she was hailed as a saint. What nobody knew at the time was that her reforms worked not because she banished foul air, but because she accidentally eliminated bacteria. Nightingale was fighting the wrong villain, but winning anyway. Doctors, meanwhile, were doubling down on their olfactory obsession. They carried posies of herbs or vials of vinegar to ward off infection. One popular device was the vinegar sponge, a pocket-sized sponge soaked in vinegar, which gentlemen would sniff before entering dangerous places. If you fainted from the fumes, at least you fainted clean. Perfume sellers marketed anti-miasmatic fragrances, claiming they could purify rooms. Lavender became the unofficial scent of false security. Architects even joined the crusade. They designed cities to breathe. Wide boulevards, open parks, and ventilated sewers weren't just for beauty. They were to disperse imaginary poison. Ironically, this obsession with airflow helped birth modern urban planning. The Victorians didn't know it, but by chasing away smells, they were building healthier cities by accident. The world's first great public health revolution started with the world's greatest misunderstanding. But miasma wasn't just bad science, it was stubborn science. When Dr. John Snow proposed that cholera spread through contaminated water, many doctors laughed him out of the room. "Everyone knows it's the smell," they cried, while standing next to open sewers. Snow had data. They had noses. Guess which one Parliament preferred? The belief in miasma was comforting because it offered a simple enemy: the air itself. You could smell danger coming, unlike invisible germs. Even after Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch proved that microorganisms cause disease, miasma theory refused to die quietly. It lingered like the very stench it warned about, fading only at the end of the 19th century. By then, the Victorians had spent decades scrubbing, ventilating and perfuming their way toward progress, a strange scented stumble into modernity. Looking back, it's easy to laugh, but it's also strangely admirable. They were wrong about why filth killed, but right that it did. Their noses led them to demand cleaner streets, better housing, and organised waste removal. Sometimes even bad science can create good results, especially when it smells this bad. The good news, fresh air really does make you feel better. The bad news, it won't stop cholera if you're still drinking corpse tea. A summer so foul, Parliament fled London, forcing sanitation reform through sheer survival instinct. When the stench makes lawmakers run, progress begins. It started, as all great Victorian catastrophes did, with heat and denial. The year was 1858, and London was already a city teetering between grandeur and garbage. The Industrial Revolution had filled its coffers, but also its rivers. Then came June, a summer so blistering that even the Thames seemed to be sweating. As temperatures soared past 90 degrees or 32 degrees, the river that powered an empire began to bubble, ferment and revolt. The Thames had always been filthy, of course. It had spent decades as the capital's unofficial wastebasket, swallowing everything from factory runoff to household refuse. But in 1858, the heat turned the river from a nuisance into a weapon. Every tide brought waves of decomposition rolling through the heart of London. The stench was not just unpleasant, it was existential. Newspapers described it as a stink that strikes at the very soul. Eyewitnesses claimed the air shimmered with oily fumes. Curtains were soaked in disinfectant, windows nailed shut, and men tied vinegar-soaked handkerchiefs around their faces like battlefield medics. To cross Westminster Bridge was to gamble with your lungs. Clerks fainted at their desks, riverboat crews abandoned ship, fish died by the ton bobbing to the surface like tragic confetti. The Thames, once romanticised in poetry, now resembled a vast steaming latrine, a bubbling broth of human waste, animal carcasses, chemical sludge, and whatever else had dared to drown in it. It was, quite literally, the smell of civilization eating itself. But what finally made the crisis historic wasn't the suffering of ordinary Londoners, it was the suffering of politicians. The Houses of Parliament sat right beside the Thames, and by mid-June, the smell had breached their Gothic walls. The great and the powerful who had ignored decades of sanitary reports suddenly found themselves gagging through committee meetings. Ink blotted on sweaty parchment as MPs pressed scented handkerchiefs to their noses. One member reportedly suggested suspending Parliament until God permits a change in the weather. Another proposed soaking the curtains in chloride of lime to mask the odour. It worked, briefly, until the curtains themselves began to rot. The spectacle was almost comedic. Imagine the ruling elite of the world's most powerful empire, armed with citrus peel and brandy, trying to outlast a river. But as the smell grew worse, panic replaced pride. The Times described the Thames as a Stygian pool, reeking with ineffable horrors. The Illustrated London News called it the Great Stink. And in a city where everything could be ignored except discomfort, the stench finally succeeded where reason had failed. Reform became not a moral duty, but an act of self-preservation. Enter Joseph Bazalgette, engineer, visionary and accidental saviour. For years, he had been quietly lobbying for a comprehensive sewer system to replace the patchwork of cesspits and drains that dumped straight into the Thames. His plans had been gathering dust on bureaucratic shelves, dismissed as too expensive. Now, with politicians holding their noses and threatening to evacuate, funding suddenly appeared faster than the tide. In a rare moment of parliamentary clarity, everyone agreed something must be done, preferably yesterday. Bazalgette's solution was monumental, a network of massive brick sewers that would intercept waste before it reached the river, carrying it east toward the sea. It was an engineering marvel, but at this moment it was also a survival strategy. The Great Stink had achieved what cholera, science and morality could not. It made reform unavoidable. Meanwhile, ordinary Londoners endured the summer like prisoners in a gaseous siege. The smell invaded homes, hospitals and churches. Weddings and funerals alike were accompanied by the omnipresent odour of decay. Perfume sales skyrocketed, but even the most expensive eau de cologne couldn't compete with a river full of rot. Some desperate souls sprinkled carbolic acid in their wells or burned tar in the streets, hoping to cleanse the air. It was all useless. The Thames was a monster that could only be tamed by rebuilding the city from the underground up. Doctors, still clinging to miasma theory, insisted that the smell itself was killing people. They weren't entirely wrong. Inhaling the foul air caused nausea and respiratory distress. But the true killer remained the contaminated water, quietly circulating disease while everyone was busy blaming their noses. Ironically, it was the miasma panic that fast-tracked reform. The government didn't yet understand germs, but they understood fear, and the stench made fear impossible to ignore. By September, cooler weather brought relief, but the lesson lingered. The Great Stink had done in 3 months what decades of public health campaigns could not. It united a divided city under the banner of disgust. Bazalgette's sewers would soon begin construction, a colossal project that would employ thousands and transform London into the cleanest city on earth. Of course, the Victorians couldn't resist congratulating themselves afterward. They turned the Great Stink into proof of their progress, forgetting that it had been their neglect that caused it in the first place. Still, it marked the end of an era, the moment London finally decided to stop marinating in its own history. The Thames would recover, the city would rise, and somewhere in a dusty engineering office, Joseph Bazalgette probably allowed himself a rare smile, knowing that his masterpiece had been inspired not by glory, but by the worst smell in recorded human history. The good news? London was finally cleaning up its act. The bad news? It took a river's revenge to make it happen. Bazalgette built London's mighty sewers, transforming waste into engineering glory. His life's work was literally other people's crap, and he made it glorious. When the Thames turned traitor and the Great Stink sent Parliament running for their lives, one man didn't flee. He picked up a pencil. Joseph William Bazalgette was an engineer with a vision, a moustache of authority, and the patience of a saint. Where others saw a city choking on filth, he saw blueprints. Where politicians saw political suicide, he saw pipes. Bazalgette wasn't flashy. He wasn't a loud reformer or a fiery orator. He was a quiet genius who spoke fluent brickwork and mathematics. Born in 1889, trained as a civil engineer, he had spent years designing railways and drainage projects before becoming chief engineer of the Metropolitan Board of Works. In that role, he inherited a challenge that would have made lesser men take up farming, rebuild London's entire underground while it was still being lived in. Picture the city he faced. By 1858, London had ballooned into a metropolis of over 2 million people, all merrily contributing to a growing mountain of waste. The Thames had become an open wound, oozing disease into the city's veins. Bazalgette's task was to design a system that could carry this tidal wave of human output away from where people lived, and make sure it never came back. Essentially, he had to build a digestive system for the largest city on Earth. No pressure. And yet, Bazalgette approached the problem with the calm precision of a surgeon. His plan was revolutionary. a series of massive intercepting sewers running parallel to the Thames, catching waste before it reached the river and diverting it eastward toward the estuary. It was elegant, logical, and absolutely gargantuan. In total, it required over 300 miles of drains and 82 miles of main tunnels, all constructed by hand, because Victorian workers hadn't invented backhoes, just back pain. To appreciate Bazalgette's genius, you have to understand the scale. Each brick was carefully chosen, every curve mathematically calculated to ensure smooth flow. The tunnels were lined with millions of bricks, 318 million to be exact, and built large enough for a double-decker bus to pass through, though hopefully without passengers. The whole system relied on gravity, a masterpiece of subtle slopes and gradients guiding sewage eastward like an obedient army. And because Bazalgette was no fool, he overbuilt everything. He calculated the sewer capacity based on London's population, then doubled it just in case. This act of cautious over-engineering is why even today parts of his system are still in use. Modern Londoners flush their toilets without realising they're part of a 19th century design. Bazalgette may have died in 1891, but his plumbing lives on. The work itself was Herculean. Construction began in 1859 and lasted over a decade. The labourers, often called navvies, dug through clay, gravel, and occasionally the remnants of earlier civilizations. Nothing says history like finding Roman pottery next to a Victorian cesspit. They endured heat, floods, cave-ins, and the constant perfume of what they were working to eliminate. Accidents were frequent, morale questionable, and yet the project pressed forward, a triumph of endurance as much as engineering. Above ground, Londoners marvelled as the city transformed. Grand embankments rose along the Thames, the Victoria, the Albert, and the Chelsea. These weren't just decorative walkways, they concealed massive underground sewers and pumping stations. Bazalgette understood something few engineers did. Infrastructure could be beautiful. He turned necessity into civic pride. What lay hidden beneath was pure utility. What lay above was pure Victorian grandeur. Then there were the pumping stations, cathedrals of sanitation. The most famous, Crossness and Abbey Mills, were temples of iron and tile, filled with ornate columns, gilded arches, and steam-powered pumps that could move tons of sewage every minute. It's as if Bazalgette looked at a pile of sludge and thought, you know what this needs? Gothic architecture. His pumping stations weren't just functional, they were declarations of victory over decay. Of course, the project didn't come cheap. The final bill was around 4.2 million, a fortune at the time. Critics howled, calling it excessive. But when the sewers finally opened and London's cholera outbreaks vanished, nobody complained. Bazalgette had done what decades of hand-wringing reformers and perfumed politicians could not. He had given London clean water, clean air, and a second chance. For the first time in centuries, the Thames began to recover. The city no longer reeked like a compost heap. Death rates plummeted. The river sparkled, well, less murky anyway, and Londoners could finally stroll its banks without fainting. Bazalgette became a quiet national hero. Queen Victoria knighted him in 1875, but the engineer himself never sought glory. His true satisfaction lay in the flow rate of a well-built drain. There's something poetic about it. In an age obsessed with appearances, powdered wigs, marble halls, polite conversation, Joseph Bazalgette's masterpiece lay underground, invisible and indispensable. He built the veins of a living city, the unsung infrastructure that made modern London possible. The Victorians may have built palaces for their monarchs, but Bazalgette built one for their waste, and it was magnificent. The good news, Bazalgette proved that even the dirtiest problems can inspire genius. The bad news, his legacy was literally full of crap, and everyone depended on it. Brick tunnels, grand arches, and perfect gradients of wall turned sewage management into industrial art. Victorian engineers could turn sewage into a work of art. Talk about polishing a turd. To truly appreciate the miracle that was Victorian engineering, you have to go underground, literally. London's sewers weren't just a network of pipes. They were a cathedral of brick and logic, a subterranean city built by men who believed that geometry could save civilization. While the streets above echoed with the clatter of carriages and the gossip of polite society, below ground was a silent masterpiece, the heart and lungs of modern London, designed with mathematical precision and somehow aesthetic grace. Joseph Bazalgette's grand vision had already been approved, but turning that vision into reality required an army of engineers, surveyors, masons and navvies, short for navigators, the labourers who dug canals and railways. They worked with picks, shovels and dynamite, digging through London clay in conditions that could politely be described as awful. The air was humid and heavy, the tunnels dark and claustrophobic. There was no modern machinery, no mechanical drills or ventilation fans, just human muscle, lanterns, and a remarkable tolerance for stench. And yet what they built was astonishing. The tunnels were not crude holes. They were crafted with the precision of cathedrals. Engineers calculated exact gradients so that waste would flow naturally by gravity, at just the right speed, fast enough to prevent settling, but slow enough to avoid eroding the brick. The tolerance for error? Barely an inch over miles of tunnel. One miscalculation and London's sewage would either stagnate or backflow in truly regrettable ways. Bazalgette's team didn't just build pipes, they built rivers of mathematics. The sewers themselves were architectural wonders. Many were horseshoe-shaped for strength, lined with hand-laid bricks that gleamed under lamplight. The masons used special Portland cement that could withstand constant moisture and pressure. Some tunnels were so vast that inspectors could ride through them on small boats, a Victorian luxury cruise no one asked for. The brickwork curves were so perfect that later engineers, armed with laser levels, were astonished at how accurate 19th century workmanship could be. The crown jewels of the system were its pumping stations. Crossness, on the south bank of the Thames, was the pinnacle, a structure so ornate it looked like a church for sanitation. Cast iron columns, painted in crimson and gold, rose toward a vaulted ceiling. Massive beam engines, nicknamed Victoria, Prince Consort, Albert Edward, and Alexandra, pumped thousands of gallons of sewage every minute. Visitors described the machinery as sublime, a word usually reserved for art galleries and mountain landscapes. Bazalgette had somehow turned waste management into a symphony of steam and steel. At the northern end, the Abbey Mills pumping station matched its southern twin in grandeur. Its Byzantine domes and intricate tilework earned it the nickname the Cathedral of Sewage. You could stand in its great hall and forget for a moment that the air above those beautiful tiles was literally moving excrement. The Victorians, in their boundless optimism, believed that even the dirtiest work deserved dignity. If civilization depended on sewage, then sewage deserved a palace. And it worked beautifully. The intercepting sewers collected waste from smaller local drains and funneled it eastward, away from the city centre. From there, the pumping stations lifted it up into massive outfall sewers that carried it even farther downstream, where it was released into the Thames estuary. The process was continuous, efficient and, by Victorian standards, miraculous. Londoners no longer had to breathe the byproducts of their own civilization. The Thames began to recover. Water ran clearer. The city stopped dying from its own water. Yet even beyond sanitation, Bazalgette sewers were a triumph of industrial art. They represented the height of Victorian faith in progress, the idea that anything, even human waste, could be conquered by ingenuity and masonry. The tunnels weren't hidden shamefully, they were celebrated. Newspaper illustrations depicted workers deep underground, lanterns casting heroic shadows on brick walls. Engineers became celebrities, and the public learned to view sewers not as symbols of filth but of human triumph. Of course, not everyone appreciated the aesthetic. When the Crossness pumping station opened in 1865, Queen Victoria herself was invited to inspect it. According to legend, she declined to go inside, presumably because even the most beautiful sewage still smells like sewage. But others, including journalists, scientists, and foreign dignitaries, came to marvel. The system became a model for cities across Europe. Paris, Hamburg, and New York all borrowed ideas from London's underground empire. Maintaining the sewers was no small feat either. Flushers and inspectors patrolled the tunnels with lamps, checking for blockages, leaks, or, disturbingly often, entire pigs that had somehow fallen into drains. Despite the grim conditions, workers took pride in their domain. Some even left their names scratched into the bricks, graffiti of gratitude to the system that kept their city alive. Today, more than a century and a half later, Bazalgette's system still forms the backbone of London's sanitation. Modern engineers continue to use his tunnels, often amazed that Victorian design anticipated a population far larger than he could have imagined. His decision to double the sewer capacity remains one of the most brilliant acts of foresight in urban planning. So next time you flush a toilet in London, remember, the water's journey began in a masterpiece of brick and genius. The Victorians may have been obsessive, moralising, and occasionally delusional, but when it came to engineering, they built with both pride and poetry. The good news? London gained an underground marvel that still works. The bad news? The city's most beautiful architecture is full of what people preferred not to talk about. Inspectors, planners, and reformers launched a bureaucratic crusade against filth. Paperwork couldn't kill germs, but it made everyone feel cleaner. Once London's sewers began to flow and the Thames stopped trying to kill people, the Victorians did what Victorians did best. They turned sanitation into a moral crusade wrapped in bureaucracy. Having finally realised that filth was a national embarrassment, Britain declared war on dirt. And like any true British war, it was fought with committees, reports, and enough paperwork to bury a horse. The mid-19th century saw the rise of the sanitary inspector, a new kind of foot soldier armed not with muskets but with measuring sticks, notebooks, and righteous indignation. Their mission to root out squalor wherever it lurked. They prowled alleys, tenements, and workhouses, poking into cellars and counting the flies on privy doors. It was part detective work, part moral inquisition. If your backyard smelled off and an inspector was coming for you. And heaven help you if your cesspit leaked, the Victorians now had a form for that. At the top of this new hygiene hierarchy were reformers like Edwin Chadwick, the man who practically turned sanitation into a religion. Chadwick believed that cleanliness wasn't just about health, it was about national efficiency. A dirty worker was a sick worker, and a sick worker couldn't make money or pay taxes, thus every blocked drain became an economic crisis. His monumental 1842 report on the sanitary condition of the labouring population was a 400-page love letter to drains, packed with enough horrifying statistics to make even Parliament lose its appetite. He argued that poverty and disease were the results of environmental neglect. In short, clean the streets, save the nation. It worked. Parliament, once paralysed by the smell of reform, began to legislate cleanliness. The Public Health Act of 1848 created local health boards responsible for drainage, waste removal, and water supply. It was the bureaucratic equivalent of installing a conscience in government. Every town now had someone whose job it was to care about your rubbish. Some cities even formed nuisance committees, yes, that was the actual title, to handle complaints about smells, overflowing privies, and livestock with questionable hygiene habits. But like all bureaucracies, the sanitary movement quickly turned into an empire of its own. Health boards demanded reports from inspectors, who demanded reports from landlords, who demanded that tenants stop dying so much. Sanitary conferences were held, minutes were taken, quills were dipped. Britain's war against waste became less about drains and more about documentation. You could practically drown in the paperwork before you drowned in the sewage. Still, the inspectors were relentless. They had the power to issue fines, shut down workshops, or force landlords to install proper drains. They climbed into basements, measured ventilation, and scolded anyone who seemed too cosy with dirt. To the Victorians, cleanliness was next to godliness, and inspectors were the new clergy. If you were poor, their visits were both a blessing and a curse. They might save you from cholera. but they'd also tell you to wash your curtains more often. Meanwhile, reformers and urban planners started reimagining the very structure of cities. Narrow alleys were condemned as fever traps. Entire neighbourhoods were demolished to make way for wider, better ventilated streets. The word slum entered the national vocabulary, and city maps began to colour-code poverty as if it were a contagious rash. The ideal Victorian city would be one of symmetry, sanitation and surveillance, a place where nothing foul could hide and everything could be inspected. Public health campaigns joined the fight, turning posters and pamphlets into propaganda weapons. "Keep your home clean," cried the broadsiders, featuring illustrations of smiling mothers scrubbing floors while angelic children held buckets. It was civic duty wrapped in soapsuds. The message was clear. If you were dirty, it wasn't just unhealthy, it was unpatriotic. Empire, it seemed, ran on disinfectant. But there was irony in this cleanliness crusade. The same society that condemned the poor for their filth often dumped its own waste just beyond city limits. Out of sight, out of mind became policy. Wealthy districts hired private cleaners to whisk away rubbish at dawn, ensuring that their streets remained spotless, while someone else's suburb became the dumping ground. The war against waste, like all wars, had collateral damage. Still, progress was undeniable. By the 1860s, local councils were building refuse depots, street cleaning departments, and organised waste collection routes. Dustmen became public servants rather than scavengers. Waste began to be classified, sorted, and, in some cases, recycled into fertiliser or building material. For the first time in history, urban cleanliness wasn't just about vanity, it was infrastructure. And of course no Victorian reform could resist moralising. Sermons compared spiritual purity to proper drainage. Sunday schools taught children about the virtues of soap and sunlight. Sanitation became metaphor. Politicians called for moral cleansing of the nation, as if sewage and sin could be flushed away together. A clean street was proof of a civilised heart. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was revolutionary. The bureaucracy of sanitation, with its inspectors, laws, and endless reports, quietly saved more lives than any general or king. The Victorians may have written more about filth than anyone in history, but in the process, they built the modern city. The good news, the paperwork worked, sort of. The bad news, London was now addicted to red tape as much as it had been to grime. Indoor plumbing arrived with pride and flooding as early flushes tested London's patience. For every triumphant flush, 10 basements drowned in regret. The Victorians loved progress, especially the kind that involved levers, pipes, and an opportunity to boast about civilization's superiority. And few inventions symbolise modernity better than the indoor toilet. It was the crown jewel of cleanliness, the porcelain throne of progress. The only problem? The technology that made it possible was about as stable as a drunk pigeon. Before the flush toilet became fashionable, most Britons relied on chamber pots and privies, simple, smelly and low maintenance. But when the mid-19th century sewer revolution began sweeping through London, people wanted in. If the Queen has a flush toilet, they reasoned, so should I. Never mind that Her Majesty's Palace had slightly better plumbing than the average tenement. The middle classes were determined to modernise, and what could be more genteel than doing one's business with hydraulic flair? The first wave of modern toilets were marvels of awkward genius. Inventors like Alexander Cumming and Thomas Crapper, yes, that was his real name, and no, he didn't invent the toilet, he just made it famous, improved the S-bend and flushing mechanism. Victorian advertisements promised elegance and hygiene. No more smells, no more shame. Flush toilets were marketed like luxury vehicles, complete with polished handles, mahogany seats, and poetic names like the Dolphin or the Excelsior. Nothing says refinement like going to the bathroom on furniture that looks like it belongs in a library. But here's the problem. Victorian plumbing wasn't ready for mass enthusiasm. London's new sewers were designed to handle waste, yes, but not a tidal wave of water coming from every home at once. The early flush toilets used a lot of water, sometimes as much as 10 gallons per pull. Multiply that by thousands of eager homeowners all flushing in the morning, and the result was hydraulic mayhem. Pressure surges rattled pipes, drains gurgled ominously, and the lucky few discovered that their plumbing worked beautifully until the neighbours didn't. Some houses experienced reverse flow, a polite Victorian term for sewage erupting where it didn't belong. It was as if the toilets had developed stage fright and decided to vomit their contents back up in protest. Newspapers reported flooded kitchens, exploding pipes, and even geysers of filth shooting from street drains during rainstorms. Early adopters of indoor plumbing quickly learned that convenience had consequences. The dream of sanitary elegance often ended with buckets and despair. Water companies weren't helping. Their supply systems were inconsistent and water pressure fluctuated wildly. One moment your toilet refused to flush, the next it flushed with the enthusiasm of Niagara Falls. Engineers were still learning how to balance household plumbing with public supply networks. In many cases, toilets shared connections with kitchen sinks, because nothing says bon appetit like recycled bathwater. Yet despite the chaos, the flush toilet became the ultimate Victorian status symbol. Having one signified wealth, sophistication, and an advanced moral compass. After all, clean living was next to godliness, and now you could be both without leaving your bedroom. The working classes, meanwhile, often shared outdoor privies, entire rows of them serving multiple families. The contrast between marble-seated toilets in Mayfair and freezing outhouses in Whitechapel summed up the era's favourite paradox: progress for some, plumbing disasters for others. Public toilets, or public conveniences, as the ever-polite Victorians called them, were another revolutionary development. The first paid public toilet opened at the Great Exhibition of 1851, costing a penny to use, hence the famous phrase, "to spend a penny." For that single copper coin you gained access to privacy, dignity and a clean seat, a small miracle in a century still figuring out soap. Public conveniences spread rapidly through railway stations and city squares, complete with attendants, polished brass fixtures, and signs assuring patrons of sanitary respectability. They were the Wi-Fi hotspots of their day, essential, admired, and occasionally unreliable. Naturally, the press couldn't resist turning toilets into a moral debate. Some conservatives fretted that private plumbing would encourage laziness or indecency. After all, people might spend too much time in there reading newspapers. Others claimed the constant availability of flushing water was wasteful, even dangerous. There were pamphlets warning that excessive flushing could disturb the balance of natural vapours, or even weaken the constitution. Victorians never missed an opportunity to turn progress into panic. And then there were the inventors. Thomas Crapper, the most famous name in plumbing history, ran a successful business installing high-quality toilets across London. His showrooms displayed dozens of gleaming models, inviting customers to browse the future of hygiene. His contribution wasn't invention, but innovation, improving design, promoting better valves, and proving that sanitation could be stylish. By the late 1800s, his company's stamp, T. Crapper & Co., appeared on toilet fittings throughout the empire, a global badge of flushing pride. Of course, not everyone was convinced. The very idea of defecating indoors horrified traditionalists. Filth belongs outside, they argued, clinging to their backyard privies as if they were defending civilization. But eventually practicality won. Indoor plumbing meant comfort, safety, and far fewer encounters with night soil men. It also meant an entirely new relationship with water, one that turned waste disposal into a private, invisible act. By century's end, the flush toilet was no longer a novelty, it was a necessity. The aristocracy had them in marble, the middle classes had them in polished oak, the poor dreamed of having them at all. The revolution of sanitation had entered the home, one handle pull at a time. The good news, civilization now had a button for dignity. The bad news, if you lived downstairs, you prayed your upstairs neighbour didn't flush too hard. Cleanliness became a moral virtue marketed through soap, sin and shame. Being clean wasn't just about health, it was about judging your neighbours. By the mid-Victorian era, Britain had discovered the cure for both dirt and damnation: a bar of soap. What began as a matter of sanitation evolved into something much grander, a full-blown moral crusade. Soap was no longer just a household item, it was an identity. It promised purity of the body and the soul, neatly packaged in lavender scent and moral superiority. To the Victorians, cleanliness wasn't just hygienic, it was holy. Reformers and preachers alike began preaching the gospel of soap. Dirt, they declared, wasn't merely unpleasant, it was evidence of moral decay. The unwashed weren't just unhygienic, they were ungodly. It was a time when scrubbing your hands could make you feel virtuous, and scrubbing someone else's meant you were saving their soul. At the heart of this cleanliness campaign was a rapidly growing soap industry, fueled by both chemistry and capitalism. The invention of cheaper mass-produced soap in the early 19th century transformed washing from a luxury into a moral obligation. Companies like Pears, Brothers and Sunlight Soap weren't selling hygiene, they were selling redemption. Their advertisements didn't just promise softer skin, they promised social elevation. One Pears soap ad famously declared that soap is civilization. The message was clear: if you wanted to be seen as respectable, you'd better start lathering. And the Victorians took the message to heart, sometimes aggressively. Middle-class women, newly armed with soap and social mobility, became domestic missionaries. Cleanliness became their battlefield, the home their chapel, and grime their enemy. A well-scrubbed doorstep was a declaration of virtue, a shiny kettle, proof of moral fibre. Laundry day was no longer a chore, it was an act of piety. Housewives wielded soap with the zeal of crusaders, determined to keep their linens and consciences spotless. Soap also became political. As the British Empire expanded, so did its belief that cleanliness equaled civilization. Missionaries carried Bibles in one hand and bars of soap in the other, convinced they were bringing light and lather to the unclean corners of the world. In their eyes, washing was not only physical purification, but also moral colonization. It wasn't enough to convert souls. You had to scrub them first. The marketing was genius and insidious. Soap advertisements in the late 1800s didn't just sell products. They sold hierarchies. They showed before and after transformations, where grubby figures, often depicted as poor or foreign, became radiant, smiling citizens after a single wash. The implication was unmistakable. Dirt was not just filth. It was class, race, and sin all rolled into one. Cleanliness, therefore, became social currency. The whiter your linens, the higher your standing, the cleaner your hands, the cleaner your conscience. Even literature joined the soapbox parade. Victorian novels were filled with spotless heroines whose virtue gleamed as brightly as their petticoats. A woman with dirty fingernails could never be trusted. She was surely one bad decision away from moral collapse. Characters like Dickens's Angels of the House or Mrs. Beeton's domestic goddesses embodied this obsession. To be respectable was to be scrubbed. Dirt was dangerous not because it spread disease, but because it hinted at chaos, and the Victorians hated nothing more than chaos. The result was an entire culture obsessed with appearances. Polished shoes, crisp collars, gleaming cutlery. Everything had to sparkle, not merely for cleanliness, but for social validation. To be seen as dirty was to risk exclusion. Respectability became performative. And soap was its stage makeup. Of course, this moral sparkle had a darker side. Many working-class families couldn't afford the luxury of constant washing. Coal dust, factory grime, and cramped living conditions made respectable cleanliness nearly impossible. Yet the middle class still judged them harshly, as if moral failure could be measured in soap residue. Philanthropists published pamphlets urging the poor to embrace the habits of decency, conveniently ignoring that fresh water and soap cost money. Poverty stank, literally. And Victorians made sure everyone knew whose fault they thought it was. Even the language of cleanliness turned sanctimonious. Words like pure, fresh, and wholesome were used not just for laundry, but for people. A clean heart, a spotless reputation, a tainted soul. The vocabulary of hygiene became the vocabulary of virtue. Advertisements played into this moral theatre. One Sunlight soap ad showed a mother bathing her child under the slogan, "The white man's burden made light." The hypocrisy was so thick you could have scrubbed it with a loofah. At home, soap became part of every ritual. Bathing, once a rare luxury, became a regular expectation for those who could afford it. Towels multiplied, bathtubs gleamed, and scented soaps turned private bathrooms into small temples of purity. Sunday baths became as sacred as Sunday sermons. Even children were taught that clean hands lead to good hearts, which was charming, until you remembered it was mostly an excuse for mothers to chase them around with washcloths. But beneath all the moral froth, there was truth. Cleanliness did save lives. Better hygiene reduced infections, lowered child mortality, and improved general health. Soap may have been a symbol of snobbery, but it was also one of progress. The Victorians, for all their sanctimonious scrubbing, were slowly washing away centuries of disease. Still, one can't help but admire the irony. A society that had spent decades wallowing in its own waste had now decided that moral worth came down to how many times a week you washed behind your ears. The same people who once dumped chamber pots into the street now look down their powdered noses at those who smelled earthy. The good news, cleanliness finally became contagious. The bad news, so did smugness. Bathhouses gave the poor a chance to wash with dignity and company. Victorian public baths, where cleanliness met awkward eye contact. By the mid-1800s, the average working-class Briton had about as much access to a private bath as they did to a holiday in Venice. For most, washing meant a quick splash at the kitchen sink, or if you were lucky, a small tin tub once a week, provided the children, husband, or in-laws hadn't already used the water. But when sanitation reforms swept across Britain, it didn't just clean the streets, it also cleaned the people. Enter the public bath and wash house movement, a government-approved excuse to take your clothes off in public, respectfully. The idea was revolutionary. If filth was breeding disease, then surely giving people somewhere to bathe would fix that. Philanthropists, reformers, and city councils joined forces to build bathhouses where even the poorest citizens could wash themselves in their laundry for a penny or two. It was cleanliness for the masses, civility for sale, and a new kind of social experiment. What happens when you put 50 Victorians in one steamy room and tell them to behave? The first public baths opened in Liverpool in 1842, quickly followed by the London's Grand Public Baths and Washhouses Act of 1846, which gave councils the authority and a polite shove to build them across the nation. These were no crude sheds. They were civic temples of hygiene. Many were designed in the same grand architectural style as libraries or town halls. Domed ceilings, tiled corridors, and impressive facades that declared cleanliness as civilization. Because in true Victorian fashion, if you were going to bathe, you might as well do it under a fresco. Inside, the facilities were divided by class and gender naturally. The first-class baths featured private cubicles, warm water, and attendants ready to offer towels, a luxury that cost a few pennies more. The second-class section, meanwhile, offered a simpler experience. Tepid water, wooden benches, and a level of privacy that could charitably be described as conceptual. Still, for many working-class Londoners, this was paradise compared to the home bucket routine. Then there were the washhouses, massive steam-powered laundries where women brought baskets of clothes, paid a small fee, and spent the day scrubbing, boiling, and gossiping. The air was thick with soap steam and conversation. These spaces became informal social hubs, part community centre, part endurance test. You could share recipes, moral judgments, and the latest news while waiting for your linens to dry. And yes, the occasional scandal. More than one moral panic erupted over improper behaviour in the warm, steamy rooms. The Victorians feared that too much humidity might weaken the nation's moral fibre. Cleanliness was now a matter of civic pride. Councils boasted about how many baths their towns contained, and reformers measured progress by the number of towels distributed. Posters urged citizens to bathe weekly, as if personal hygiene were a patriotic duty. Children were marched to the baths by school teachers. Soldiers were ordered to bathe before enlistment. Even prisons and workhouses adopted bathing schedules, proof that civilization could now be quantified in gallons of hot water. The bathhouse attendants, often stern middle-aged women armed with mops, became the unsung enforcers of Victorian decency. They ensured no one lingered too long, sang too loudly, or, heaven forbid, attempted mixed bathing. Yet for all the rules, there was joy too. Imagine the feeling of stepping into warm water after a lifetime of cold washes in a bucket, the sensation of comfort, privacy, and, for once, dignity. For the working poor, these were moments of transformation, but not everyone approved. Critics sniffed, perhaps too literally, that public baths encouraged idleness, immorality, or, worst of all, the mingling of social classes. Why should the poor be pampered with warm water? Some landlords complained that bathhouses spoiled tenants by teaching them luxurious habits. Others accused the government of wasting money on soap when it should be saving souls. To them, cleanliness was fine, as long as it stayed aspirational. Still, the movement spread like bubbles in hot water. By 1870, there were dozens of public baths in major cities, and by the 1890s, hundreds. Some even featured swimming pools, the first indoor pools in Britain, long before sport overtook sanitation. They became places not just to wash, but to socialise, exercise, and escape the grind of industrial life. For many, it was their first experience of leisure, of stepping into a world where filth wasn't destiny. Public baths also helped reshape the relationship between citizens and the state. Cleanliness was no longer a private matter. It was a public responsibility. Municipalities began to see hygiene as infrastructure, not luxury. Health officers reported attendance numbers, tracked disease rates, and even used bathhouse statistics as proof of urban progress. In a strange twist, soap and water had become tools of governance. And so, by the twilight of the Victorian era, the great experiment had succeeded. The city's working classes were cleaner, healthier, and perhaps a little more self-aware about who was watching them bathe. The movement inspired global imitators, from New York to Bombay, spreading the gospel of civic cleanliness across the empire. Of course, for all its noble intentions, the bathhouse could still be a deeply awkward experience. Stripping down under flickering gaslight while strangers coughed in the next stall wasn't exactly a spa day. But for most Victorians, modesty came second to the sheer relief of not smelling like Tuesday's chimney soot. The good news, cleanliness had become a right, not a privilege. The bad news, you still had to make small talk in a towel. Wider roads, drains, and zoning reshaped cities into cleaner, more breathable spaces. Victorian logic: if we can't make people cleaner, at least move the smell somewhere else. Once the Victorians realised that filth wasn't just unsightly but politically embarrassing, they decided to rebuild their cities from the ground up, or rather, from the sewer up. The sanitation reforms of the mid-19th century had cleaned the air, drained the cesspits, and made the Thames almost drinkable again. Almost. But urban Britain still looked like someone had spilled a factory on a medieval map. Narrow alleys, haphazard streets, and overcrowded housing made the city a labyrinth of misery. And so began the next phase of the cleanliness crusade. Urban planning, the art of telling people where they and their smells could live. Victorian urban planning wasn't just about beauty, it was about survival. Disease had proven that a city's health depended on its design. The old maze-like neighbourhoods were seen as death traps, fever dens, cholera alleys, and pestilential warrens appeared in health reports with grim regularity. Reformers, architects, and engineers joined forces to create a new kind of city, one that could breathe. If the streets of medieval London had been built for carts and chaos, the new ones were to be built for light, air, and the unstoppable march of progress and, conveniently, traffic. The inspiration came partly from abroad. When Baron Haussmann transformed Paris in the 1850s, demolishing medieval quarters to make way for grand boulevards, airy parks, and sewer lines. British planners took notes. Londoners looked at the newly sanitised Paris and thought, well, if the French can do it, surely we can make something just as magnificent, but with fewer cafes and more fog. The result was a wave of urban redesign. New roads cut through old slums, and boulevards sliced across districts that had once been mazes of filth and humanity. Of course, this process often came at the expense of the poor, who were politely relocated when their homes were demolished for the greater good. Victorian progress had a way of smelling like disinfectant and eviction. Entire communities disappeared under the banners of improvement and air circulation. Reformers argued that wider streets would let in sunlight and moral uplift. Critics noted that they also made it easier for police and the military to control crowds, a happy coincidence in an era of frequent riots. The new cityscape took shape in brick and stone. Street grids were straightened, pavements widened, and drains discreetly tucked beneath the cobblestones. Public squares sprouted fountains, symbols of purity and progress, though few dared to drink from them. Parks became the lungs of the industrial city, offering workers a taste of greenery and moral renewal. Hyde Park, Regent's Park, and later Victoria Park became outdoor sermons on civility. Don't riot, just picnic. Urban zoning emerged as a new concept too. Planners began to separate residential, commercial and industrial areas, not out of aesthetic preference but out of olfactory necessity. Nobody wanted to live next to a tannery or gasworks anymore, and the upper classes were determined never to smell their wealth being made. Thus, factories were pushed to the city's edge, while the inner districts became showcases of cleanliness and control. Map of class began to align neatly with the map of smell. Street lighting was another triumph. Gas lamps lined the boulevards, banishing the murky shadows that once hid crime and questionable smells. To the Victorians, light was not just practical, and it was moral. It revealed filth, discouraged vice, and symbolised progress. Urban illumination became a form of public hygiene for the eyes. The same went for paving. Smooth, washable surfaces replaced mud and muck, giving the impression that civilization was finally waterproof. The municipal reformers even tackled garbage. Horse manure, ash and rubbish once left to pile in alleys were now systematically collected by scavengers and dustmen. New refuse depots appeared on the city's fringes, where waste was sorted, recycled or dumped, ideally somewhere out of sight and preferably downwind. Urban management had become a science. The Victorians might not have invented modern recycling, but they certainly invented the committee meeting about it. Perhaps the most striking change, however, was aesthetic. The Victorians believed that beauty was sanitary, that clean lines, symmetrical facades and wide vistas uplifted the spirit and discouraged vice. Architecture became moral instruction in brick. A well-ordered street was a sermon in stone, telling citizens to behave. Even the colour of buildings mattered. London's new terraces gleamed white, courtesy of endless scrubbing, while soot-blackened factories were politely exiled to the horizon. Engineers and planners were hailed as national heroes. Maps were drawn with precision bordering on obsession. Committees debated how wide roads should be, how deep drains should run, and even what kind of gravel best discouraged puddles. The Victorians had transformed chaos into calculus. The urban environment was no longer something people merely lived in. It was something they managed, inspected, and ideally bragged about. Yet for all their ambition, the results were uneven. The middle and upper classes enjoyed their cleaner, more picturesque neighbourhoods, while the poor were often pushed into newly built model dwellings, tidy but cramped housing blocks with walls so thin you could hear your neighbour sneeze and moralise about it simultaneously. Progress, like everything Victorian, came wrapped in contradiction. Visionary on paper, uncomfortable in practice. Still, there's no denying the impact. The modern city, with its grids, parks, lighting and drainage, was born out of Victorian anxiety about filth. Urban planning became a kind of secular salvation, proof that even a metropolis could be purified with enough geometry and money. The planners saw themselves not as mere builders, but as doctors of the urban body, performing civic surgery with rulers and compasses. The good news? The city could finally breathe. The bad news? So could the bureaucracy that ran it. Reformers like Edwin Chadwick turned hygiene from a moral issue into government duty. Chadwick wanted everyone to live longer, preferably to keep paying taxes. If the Victorians had a single superpower, it was turning panic into policy. After decades of choking on the fumes of progress, the British government finally accepted a radical idea. Perhaps the state should actually keep its citizens alive. Thus was born the public health movement, the moment when filth officially became the government's problem, and cleanliness turned into a matter of national pride and endless paperwork. The movement's unlikely father was Edwin Chadwick, a man whose personality could best be described as soap in human form, abrasive but effective. A disciple of utilitarian philosopher Jeremy Bentham, Chadwick believed that the goal of government was simple: maximise happiness and minimise stink. He was an obsessive statistician, an enemy of inefficiency, and a bureaucrat who genuinely thought sewage reports were thrilling reading. His mantra was practical to the point of parody. If people were clean and healthy, they'd work harder, live longer, and, most importantly, cost the government less. Sanitation for him was not charity, it was economic strategy. Chadwick's crowning achievement came in 1842 with his monumental report on the sanitary condition of the labouring population of Great Britain, a document so large and horrifying that it could double as a doorstop and a weapon. Page after page detailed the squalor of Britain's cities: overflowing drains, contaminated wells, children sleeping beside dung heaps, and families sharing single rooms with pigs. He didn't spare the adjectives either. His prose made poverty sound like an epidemic, and disease like a tax liability. His conclusion was blunt: if the poor were dying young, it wasn't from divine punishment, it was from bad plumbing. The report scandalised Parliament. The upper classes, previously content to hold their noses and pretend not to notice the smell, were suddenly faced with data. And nothing terrifies a Victorian politician quite like numbers. Chadwick had statistics showing that mortality rates in working-class districts were twice those of wealthier areas. In Liverpool, 1 in 3 children died before their 5th birthday. In Manchester, life expectancy was lower than that of soldiers in wartime. Disease wasn't just tragic, it was inefficient. The empire couldn't run on corpses. The result was a slow but unstoppable awakening. The government began to see health as infrastructure, something that could be managed, measured and legislated. In 1848, after much lobbying and debate, Parliament passed the Public Health Act, creating the General Board of Health. It was Britain's first attempt at centralised sanitation policy, complete with inspectors, engineers, and the all-important power to build drains without asking politely first. And who better to run it than Chadwick himself? Once in charge, Chadwick became the ultimate micromanager of national hygiene. He dispatched inspectors across the kingdom to measure air quality, inspect wells, and count privies. He demanded reports on water purity, death rates, and the angle of street drains. Towns were ordered to appoint local health officers, build proper sewers, and keep accurate records of their own filth. It was a bureaucratic revolution, or, depending on who you asked, a bureaucratic nightmare. Local councils grumbled about the costs. Landlords fumed at being told to install drains. But Chadwick didn't care. He was a man possessed by purpose and quite possibly disinfectant fumes. He wasn't alone. Across the country, a new breed of reformer emerged. Medical officers, social scientists and statisticians who treated filth like an enemy army. John Simon, London's first medical officer of health, became the movement's strategist, turning hygiene into science rather than moral panic. Meanwhile, philanthropists like Octavia Hill worked to improve housing, believing that fresh air and clean courtyards could build better citizens. For the first time, public health meant everyone's health, not just those who could afford soap. The public health movement also changed how Victorians saw their cities. Disease was no longer viewed as divine punishment, but as an engineering failure. Epidemics could be prevented, not just endured. Doctors began studying disease patterns, governments began tracking data, and sanitary science became a legitimate field. The word epidemiology entered the English language, though few could pronounce it without sounding like they had it. Of course, the new system wasn't without friction. Chadwick's zeal made him enemies everywhere. His authoritarian style, a mix of moral certainty and spreadsheet obsession, alienated nearly everyone, from politicians to plumbers. Eventually, he was forced out of his position in 1854, but by then the idea had taken root. Public health was now a state responsibility. Even without him, the machinery of hygiene kept grinding. Over time, the Public Health Act was strengthened, expanded, and copied abroad. Other countries looked to Britain's example, a rare instance where the phrase "learn from the British" didn't involve colonial awkwardness. Sanitation boards became permanent fixtures of governance. New laws regulated slaughterhouses, housing standards, water supply, and even burial practices. The same government that once ignored overflowing cesspits now counted latrines like trophies. More importantly, the movement changed the moral narrative. Cleanliness ceased to be a sign of personal virtue alone. It became a civic obligation. The citizen's duty was to wash. The government's duty was to make washing possible. Posters declared, "Health is wealth, transforming hygiene into patriotism." A clean nation was a strong nation, and a strong nation could build railways, conquer continents, and occasionally enjoy a cholera-free afternoon. By the end of the 19th century, public health had evolved from a crusade to a profession. Medical officers wrote annual reports with the gravitas of generals. Cities competed over sanitation scores. Health exhibitions displayed the latest in hygiene technology, from gleaming porcelain fixtures to diagrams of lungs that looked like railway maps. The Victorians had found a new national obsession: quantifying cleanliness. The good news? Bureaucracy had finally saved lives. The bad news? It also invented the annual health report, 400 pages of moral smugness and death statistics. Britain exported plumbing and propriety, teaching colonies that civilization meant drains, empire in action, conquering lands and installing drains. By the late Victorian era, Britain wasn't just exporting good, it was exporting hygiene. Having cleansed London of its own filth mostly, the Empire decided that sanitation was now a moral duty to the rest of the world. The British didn't just bring railways, red uniforms and bad weather, they brought sewers. Civilization, it seemed, flowed best through a properly engineered pipe. The Victorians believed that hygiene was proof of superiority, that clean streets and flushing toilets separated the civilized from the savage. If Rome had built aqueducts, then Britain would outdo it with brick sewers and a moral sermon. The Empire's engineers marched hand in hand with missionaries and bureaucrats, armed with survey maps, spirit levels, and an unshakable belief that everyone on Earth deserved to experience the joys of British plumbing, whether they wanted to or not. It began in India, the Empire's glittering and sweating to crown jewel. British officers stationed in Calcutta and Bombay found themselves overwhelmed by the tropical climate, mysterious diseases, and, worst of all, local sanitation systems that refused to cooperate with Western logic. To them, the problem wasn't the conditions created by colonial urban overcrowding or resource extraction, it was native habits. Their solution? Pipes, drains, and the gospel of soap. Colonial engineers set about transforming cities like Bombay, Madras and Delhi with drainage systems modelled on London's. Unfortunately, London's system had been designed for rain, not monsoons. The result was predictably catastrophic. Pipes flooded, sewers overflowed and mosquitoes rejoiced. But the British remained undeterred. If at first your drains don't succeed, they reasoned, dig deeper. The imperial sewer became both symbol and slogan, and proof that the empire was bringing civilization, even if it came with cholera on the side. Of course, these grand projects weren't purely altruistic. Sanitation in the colonies was often designed to protect the European quarters first. The white towns were equipped with drainage, piped water and flush toilets, while the native towns nearby continued to rely on open drains and manual scavenging. In Calcutta, officials boasted about their modern sewerage network, which conveniently ended right where the Indian population began. Empire had a hierarchy and even the sewers knew their place. Still, sanitation became a powerful tool of colonial ideology. Engineers were celebrated as heroes, bringing progress to the tropics. Reports spoke of uplifting the heathen through hygiene, as if soap could erase centuries of culture. The missionary zeal was literal. Missionaries taught indigenous converts to bathe daily, as a mark of moral as well as physical purity. Cleanliness was no longer next to godliness. It was godliness, delivered by a man in a pith helmet with a bar of carbolic soap. In Africa, the pattern repeated itself. British colonies like Lagos, Nairobi and Cape Town saw the rise of European-style sanitation systems, designed less for population health and more to protect colonial administrators from native diseases. Disease control conveniently became another justification for empire. We must stay, colonial governors insisted, for the sake of their health. Somehow that health always meant better pipes in the governor's mansion and open drains in the market square. Even in the Caribbean, sanitation became a symbol of order. Port towns like Kingston and Bridgetown built new drainage systems modelled on Victorian efficiency, though tropical rain promptly revealed just how unprepared those British blueprints were for actual tropical conditions. The locals joked that British drains were like British governors, impressive on paper, useless in a storm. To the British, however, drains were destiny. They represented the Empire's moral duty, what Rudyard Kipling called the white man's burden, only slightly smellier. Colonial reports described sewage projects in reverent tones, as if each completed pipe was a step towards salvation. Engineers were knighted. Streets were renamed after sanitation officials. In one bizarre instance, a colonial administrator in Ceylon proposed that proper sewerage would teach the natives self-respect, because apparently nothing inspires moral confidence like a well-timed flush. But beneath the rhetoric of progress lay contradiction. The same empire that preached hygiene abroad often ignored poverty and disease at home. British soldiers stationed overseas lived in cleaner conditions than factory workers in Manchester. Sanitation, it turned out, was less about compassion and more about control. A clean colony was an obedient colony. Regulations about water use, waste disposal, and public cleanliness were enforced not just for health, but as symbols of discipline, the physical embodiment of order imposed on chaos. And yet, despite the hypocrisy, the results were mixed, but undeniable. Colonial cities did modernise. Hospitals, waterworks, and public baths appeared across the empire, many of which would form the backbone of post-colonial infrastructure. Engineers from India and Egypt trained in Britain, bringing back both plumbing skills and a lifetime supply of condescension. Over time, sanitation reform became part of nationalist movements, as local leaders reclaimed the tools of hygiene from the hands of empire. "We can build our own drains," they declared, a quiet rebellion in brick and pipe. The British, of course, congratulated themselves. Newspapers back home ran stories of tropical progress, celebrating clean streets in Calcutta, while ignoring coal dust in Birmingham. Sanitation became imperial propaganda, proof that Britain was spreading not just trade but civilization itself. Engineers were depicted like explorers, stoic, mud-spattered, and glowing with moral cleanliness. Empire, after all, had to look good from a distance, and nothing says progress like a polished manhole cover. By the early 20th century, the imperial sewer had become a symbol of global modernity, a reminder that British pipes reached farther than British politics ever could. The empire's true monument wasn't the railways, the telegraph, or the Queen statue in every city square. It was the quiet, subterranean hum of drains working exactly as designed. The good news? The empire left behind plumbing that still functions in many former colonies today. The bad news? It also left behind the belief that civilization is something you install through other people's basements. Inspectors trudged through filth and fury enforcing the new cleanliness laws. They walked so modern health inspectors could complain about paperwork instead of rats. When the Public Health Acts gave Britain its first real sanitation laws, someone had to enforce them, and that someone was the sanitary inspector. These were not glamorous men, and occasionally women. They weren't politicians, doctors, or engineers. They were the boots on the ground and the empire's front line in the war against grime. Their battlefield? Back alleys, basements, and the mysterious liquids dripping between floorboards. Their weapons? A notebook, a sturdy pair of boots, and an unshakable stomach. Victorian sanitary inspectors were the unsung heroes of cleanliness, patrolling streets where even rats thought twice about living. Their job was simple on paper: ensure compliance with health regulations. In practice, it was closer to pest control meets detective fiction. They investigated leaking drains, illegal slaughterhouses, overflowing privies, contaminated wells, and any location described as smelling peculiar. If something stank, an inspector was probably already on his way, handkerchief at the ready. Each day began with the sound of polished boots on cobblestone and the smell of moral responsibility, and, unfortunately, everything else. Inspectors carried official ledgers filled with tidy columns labelled nuisance, cause, and recommended action. A nuisance might be anything from a decaying horse carcass to a neighbour who dumped chamber pots out of the window. Their job was to find it, document it, and issue sternly worded notices to the guilty. It was public service at its least glamorous and most necessary. To qualify for the job, an inspector needed both a constitution of iron and the diplomacy of a saint. They faced constant hostility. Landlords accused them of overreach. Tenants accused them of intrusion. Factory owners accused them of sabotage. Everyone, in short, hated seeing them arrive, which meant they were doing their job right. Inspectors were the physical embodiment of government meddling, marching uninvited into homes to measure damp walls and sniff suspicious odours. They didn't just enforce the law, they embodied it, in wool trousers and steel-toed boots. A typical day might see an inspector trudging through a slum in Whitechapel, clipboard in hand, counting the number of people sleeping in one room, then wading through ankle-deep sludge to check if the drain connected properly to the sewer. The smell alone could stun a horse, but they persisted, because somewhere beneath the rot and grime was the promise of a cleaner city, and perhaps a bonus from the council if they didn't die of typhoid first. One of their chief responsibilities was to issue nuisance orders, official demands for immediate improvement. These could require landlords to install drainage, repair leaking pipes, remove waste heaps, or even demolish entire buildings deemed unfit for habitation. Each order had to be documented, reviewed, and often reissued when ignored. In many ways, sanitary inspectors invented the modern art of bureaucratic persistence. They didn't wield swords, they wielded follow-up letters. Despite the endless battles with landlords and the occasional rat ambush, the work attracted men of genuine dedication. Many inspectors came from working-class backgrounds themselves and saw sanitation not just as policy but as redemption. They'd grown up in the same filthy neighbourhoods they now policed. To them, enforcing cleanliness wasn't just a job, it was personal. Each drain cleared, each cesspit sealed, was a small victory against the conditions that had killed their parents, neighbours, or children. Of course, there were moments of unintentional comedy. Inspectors told tales of finding live pigs sleeping in kitchens, unexplained moisture dripping from ceilings, and privies so neglected they had developed their own ecosystems. One inspector in Manchester famously described an entire house as so pervaded by odour that even the cat appeared subdued. Another reported discovering an illegal sausage factory operating out of a laundry, which may explain a few mysteries of Victorian cuisine. Over time, inspectors became local legends, equal parts feared and respected. Newspapers occasionally praised their valiant fight against urban decay, though more often they were depicted as nuisances themselves, the men who turned up unannounced and made everyone feel guilty for existing. Still, they held real power. A single report could shutter a factory, condemn a house, or fine a negligent landlord. It was a small revolution, ordinary civil servants wielding the authority to reshape the urban environment, one unpleasant inspection at a time. Their work expanded with every new health law. They supervised water quality testing, oversaw burial grounds, enforced slaughterhouse regulations, and occasionally arrested those who dumped waste illegally. An activity that sounds noble till you realise it involved chasing men carrying buckets of excrement down dark alleys. They also monitored contagious diseases, ensuring infected houses were fumigated and, if necessary, quarantined. Few other professions required you to write reports while wearing a gas mask made of vinegar-soaked gauze. By the late 19th century, sanitary inspectors were joined by women, a quiet but groundbreaking moment in public service. Female inspectors were often assigned to inspect tenants and advise women on hygiene, childcare and ventilation. These pioneers, armed with notebooks and decorum, brought gentler persuasion where male inspectors brought sternness. They were sometimes called lady health visitors, but make no mistake, they were as formidable as any man with a clipboard. As urban health improved, inspectors gradually shifted from crisis response to maintenance. Their notebooks grew thicker, their procedures more standardised, and their daily grind less dangerous but no less crucial. The streets grew cleaner, the drains ran smoother, and, thanks to their endless rounds of inspections, Victorian Britain began to smell less like a compost heap and more like a functioning civilization. They received little recognition. No statues were raised, no parades held. Yet the modern city owes them everything: its clean water, its pest-free streets, its safe housing standards. They were the invisible guardians of public health, slogging through filth so others wouldn't have to. The good news, their efforts built the foundation of modern sanitation enforcement. The bad news, future inspectors would inherit the same mission, just with more forms to fill and fewer rats to chase. Reform met fierce resistance from landlords and citizens who hated the noise of improvement. Victorians wanted clean streets, just not the noise of making them. For every visionary engineer or reformer dreaming of gleaming pipes and fresh air, there were 10 Victorians standing in the mud shouting, "Do we really need this?" Change, no matter how hygienic, always smells suspicious to someone, and the sanitation revolution was no exception. As soon as the first drains were dug, the great British public decided that progress was far too inconvenient, far too expensive, and far too noisy. The irony was rich. People wanted clean water, but not the taxes that funded it. They wanted better streets, but not the men with shovels who blocked their carriages. They wanted fewer epidemics, but also fewer inspectors poking around their basements. It was a paradox wrapped in bureaucracy, a nation desperate to live longer, so long as it didn't have to hear construction noises while doing so. Landlords were the first line of resistance. The Public Health Acts demanded that property owners install drains, ventilation, and proper sanitation, improvements that cost money. Many landlords preferred the traditional Victorian approach to social responsibility: denial. When inspectors ordered them to repair overflowing cesspits or build new privies, they argued, delayed, or simply vanished. Some even claimed ignorance. "The smell, you say, must be coming from next door." Others paid off officials or did the absolute bare minimum, a phenomenon still recognisable in the phrase landlord special. In the worst neighbourhoods, landlords formed informal alliances to resist reform. They knew that demolishing slums for improvement would reduce their rental income. As one London property owner complained, "The poor are dirty, but they pay promptly." Reformers saw this as moral decay. Landlords saw it as business acumen. The government saw it as an endless headache. Then came the respectable middle class, the self-proclaimed guardians of Victorian virtue, who paradoxically loathed the disruptions that cleanliness required. When Joseph Bazalgette's men began digging up London streets to install sewers, homeowners protested the intolerable racket. Newspapers were filled with letters from outraged citizens, lamenting the indecency of construction sites visible from their drawing room windows. One particularly offended gentleman in Kensington wrote, "Surely there must be a more refined way to bury pipes." There wasn't. Shopkeepers also joined the chorus of complaint. Roadworks blocked foot traffic, and the stench of open trenches drove customers away. Bakers and butchers feared that dust and debris would contaminate their goods. Even churches complained. Apparently nothing disrupted Sunday service like the rhythmic thud of workmen and the occasional burst pipe. "Progress," grumbled one vicar, "has no respect for the Sabbath." And then there was the general public, the great mass of ordinary Victorians who viewed reform with suspicion and fatigue. Many saw government sanitation laws as meddling in private life. Having survived years of filth, they were unconvinced that all this fuss about drains and ventilation was truly necessary. After all, their grandparents had lived without flushing toilets and managed just fine if you ignored the cholera. When inspectors ordered them to clean their yards or pay for new plumbing, they saw tyranny, not hygiene. Resistance sometimes turned physical. In Liverpool, mobs chased sanitary inspectors out of slum districts. In Glasgow, rioters destroyed newly installed public latrines, claiming they offended decency. Rural towns refused to build sewage systems at all, insisting that fresh country air was protection enough. In London, when new drainage projects disrupted traffic, cab drivers blocked the streets in protest, an early example of the capital's favourite tradition, being angry about roadworks. Newspapers fanned the flames. Editors accused reformers of wasting taxpayer money and inflating bureaucracy. Pamphlets warned that government control over water and sewage would lead to despotism by drain. Satirical cartoons depicted reformers as zealots armed with plungers, barging into respectable homes in search of moral dirt. One cartoon even portrayed Edwin Chadwick as a kind of sanitary dictator, commanding an army of inspectors through clouds of disinfectant. Even the wealthy weren't immune to absurdity. Aristocrats protested the extension of public sewers into their districts, fearing that the odour of working-class waste might drift upward into their gardens. Some insisted on private systems, hiring their own engineers to build independent drains, tiny empires of excremental autonomy. One duke, upon learning that his estate would be connected to the municipal sewer, declared, "I refuse to share pipes with shopkeepers." He lost the argument, and eventually the smell, and of course there was politics. Every new reform required funding, and every tax increase provoked outrage. Members of Parliament debated endlessly over who should pay for clean water, the government, the ratepayers, or perhaps divine intervention. Opponents called sanitation projects utopian nonsense, arguing that the poor would only ruin them anyway. Supporters countered that cholera didn't check bank statements before striking. Parliament predictably compromised by passing legislation that pleased no one and confused everyone. Yet through all the whining, hammering and parliamentary dithering, reform marched on. Slowly the noise became normal. Once the dust settled, even the loudest critics began to enjoy the benefits. Fewer outbreaks, cleaner air, better housing, and streets that no longer doubled as obstacle courses for refuse. The same shopkeepers who had cursed construction later bragged that customers no longer fainted from the smell outside their doors. Landlords discovered that clean, dry properties attracted higher rents. The middle classes boasted about living in improved districts, conveniently forgetting that they'd protested those very improvements a decade earlier. Still, the public's resentment never vanished completely. The Victorian passion for complaining was eternal. They had survived cholera, endured noise, and adapted to progress, but they never forgave the mud on their boots. Every new reform, no matter how beneficial, was greeted with the same weary sigh. Must they dig up the street again? The good news: the Victorians eventually accepted progress, as soon as someone else paid for it. The bad news: complaining about construction became a national pastime that Britain still proudly upholds. Deodorizers, perfumes and charcoal filters turned odour removal into a booming business. If it smelled nice, Victorians assumed it was safe. Deadly gas, just add lavender. Once the Victorians had subdued their sewers and conquered cholera, they turned to their next great enemy, smell itself, for a society that had once lived nose-deep in decay. The pendulum swung violently the other way. If filth had been the mark of barbarism, then fragrance was now the perfume of progress. The British Empire might have been built on coal and empire, but it was held together by lavender water and paranoia. The obsession was partly scientific, partly spiritual, and entirely olfactory. The old miasma theory had officially fallen, but its ghost lingered in the public imagination. Even after germ theory proved that invisible bacteria, not bad smells, caused disease, Victorians couldn't shake the conviction that odour itself was dangerous. They had spent generations equating fresh with safe, and no amount of science could outmuscle a well-trained nose. The result was a cultural arms race of air freshening that would make a modern influence blush. Victorian homes became battlegrounds of aroma. The middle-class household was armed to the teeth with deodorizers, vinegar sprays, camphor balls, rose oil burners, and the ever-reliable charcoal filter, which promised to absorb offensive vapours and improve the atmosphere of any chamber. Housewives sprinkled carbolic acid around drains, poured disinfectant into flower pots, and stuffed orange peels into coal scuttles, because nothing says cleanliness like citrus-scented soot. Manuals like Mrs. Beeton's Book of Household Management offered step-by-step guides to defeating malodorous nuisances with the same fervour used for baking or child-rearing. Perfume companies saw their moment and lunged at it. Advertisements filled newspapers promising sanitary fragrances that could purify the air. Pears, Yardley and Atkinson's flooded the market with colognes, soaps, and scented powders that claimed to neutralise domestic vapours. Some were genuinely pleasant, others smelled like someone had bottled anxiety. Scent became status. A home that smelled of roses was a home that signalled refinement, health and wealth, or at least good marketing. Even public spaces joined the battle. Train stations installed air purifiers, giant vats of chemicals designed to sweeten the atmosphere. Hospitals burned incense and eucalyptus oil in the wards. Schools encouraged daily ventilation routines. Children were marched outside for fresh air drills, their teachers convinced that a breeze could build moral character. And Parliament, still haunted by the memory of the Great Stink, invested in lime chloride to perfume its hallways, proving that political hot air was best served with a hint of lemon. The craze reached absurd heights. Street vendors sold anti-miasma sachets filled with herbs for people to wear around their necks. Ladies carried silver pomanders, ornate little balls filled with scented wax, which they pressed to their noses whenever the working class approached. Gentlemen dabbed lavender water on their handkerchiefs before entering factories, funerals, or anywhere that hinted of industry. The streets of London became a strange mix of jasmine, coal smoke, and denial. Naturally, inventors capitalised on the hysteria. The patent office was flooded with designs for mechanical deodorizers, devices that pumped purified air into rooms or disguised sewage smells with competing fragrances. There were even aromatic ventilators for public toilets, which, according to one proud engineer, would convert the effluvium of vice into the air of virtue. In practice, they converted both into a choking miasma of mint and methane. The government joined the sniffing crusade too. Sanitary authorities issued guidelines on offensive trades, requiring tanneries, breweries and chemical works to install odour control systems. Inspectors patrolled the industrial districts like perfume detectives, issuing fines to anyone whose factory offended polite nostrils. The British industrial skyline, once defined by smoke and sulphur, began to carry a faint whiff of bureaucracy and disinfectant. Meanwhile, the working poor were less impressed by this aromatic revolution. For them, deodorization was a luxury they couldn't afford. Their neighbourhoods were still full of coal smoke, horse manure, and factory exhaust. But even they couldn't escape the new standards. Social reformers began lecturing that moral improvement started with good smells. philanthropic societies distributed bars of soap alongside religious pamphlets. Cleanliness, they insisted, is next to righteousness, which was noble except that few reformers seemed willing to fund running water. The upper classes, of course, took the idea and ran straight to the perfumers. Drawing rooms reeked of exotic scents: sandalwood from India, rose oil from Turkey, patchouli from Ceylon. Scented candles flickered beside gas lamps, creating an atmosphere that could politely be described as headache-inducing. The wealthy even perfumed their letters with cologne, ensuring that every exchange of correspondence smelled faintly like self-congratulation. There were, however, darker undertones to this fragrant fixation. In hospitals and slums, powerful chemical disinfectants like carbolic acid were used liberally to mask smells, often without understanding their toxicity. Nurses and cleaners suffered burns and respiratory illness from overuse. The irony was painful. In trying to cleanse the air, the Victorians often poisoned it anew. If something smelled strong, they assumed it must be working, and if it burned your nose, that was just proof of its virtue. Even death wasn't exempt. Undertakers used floral sprays and chemical embalming scents to disguise decay. Funeral parlors became floral gas chambers, where mourners could pay their respects while quietly losing consciousness to lilac fumes. The Victorians had turned the air itself into a battlefield, a place where death and deodorant fought for dominance. By century's end, the war on smell had achieved one thing: Britain now reeked of self-control. The bad odours were mostly gone, but so was any sense of reality. Cleanliness had become performance. The nation had scrubbed and scented itself into submission, mistaking fragrance for health and purity for virtue. The good news: London finally smelled tolerable. The bad news? It smelled like a soap factory had declared moral superiority. Women became the moral enforcers of cleanliness, linking hygiene to virtue and class. Clean homes became proof of good character and unpaid labour. If the Victorian era had a motto, it might well have been, "Godliness begins with housekeeping." By the late 19th century, the sanitation revolution had made its way indoors, and women were expected to keep it there. Cleanliness was no longer just an engineering project or a public duty. It became a deeply feminine virtue, an unspoken contract between morality and mopping. Men built the sewers, but women were tasked with keeping the civilization that flowed above them spotless. In the moral logic of Victorian society, the woman's home was the nation's conscience. The household was a microcosm of empire, a miniature kingdom ruled by cleanliness, order, and emotional restraint. A spotless home signified more than hygiene. It was proof of a woman's discipline, her moral worth, and, inevitably, her husband's social standing. Dust, therefore, was not just dirt, and it was disrespect. This expectation was hammered home through books, sermons, and an endless parade of domestic advice manuals. None loomed larger than Mrs. Isabella Beeton, whose Book of Household Management, 1861, became the domestic Bible of the Victorian age. Mrs. Beeton didn't just teach recipes, she defined a lifestyle. She described the ideal woman as calm, efficient, and perpetually unsoiled. A good housekeeper was expected to run her household with military precision, ensuring that every window gleamed, every servant behaved, and every tablecloth looked as if the Queen herself might inspect it. The emotional labour required could have powered a small factory. Cleanliness, under this regime, was a performance. The drawing room, gleaming with polished brass and scented with rosewater, was not just a space, it was a statement. We are respectable, we are moral, we are clean. Middle-class women found themselves in a daily battle against dirt that symbolised far more than hygiene. The front doorstep, scrubbed daily, became a public stage, the visible proof that the family inside was upright, disciplined, and, crucially, not working class. Because class in Victorian Britain could be smelled before it was seen. The poor smelled of labour, coal, sweat, tanneries and smoke, while the rich smelled of soap, starch and imported perfume. To be clean was to be civilised, and to be dirty was to be morally suspect. Women thus bore the impossible burden of proving their family's virtue through the whiteness of their linens. A muddy child wasn't just messy, he was a social liability. This domestic ideal was, of course, a double-edged mop. On one hand, it gave women moral authority within their homes. They became the guardians of health and order, the angels in the house who kept chaos at bay. On the other hand, it trapped them in a cycle of unpaid labour so relentless that even the most devout angel must have secretly wished for cholera to take a day off. Middle-class women armed with manuals and moral ambition oversaw armies of servants who actually did the scrubbing. Working-class women, by contrast, had to be those armies. For them, domestic cleanliness was both aspiration and exhaustion. The public health movement had taught everyone that dirt was dangerous, but it didn't provide the poor with the resources to remove it. Soap, water and fuel cost money, and for a mother with 6 children in a one-room tenement, the ideal of a home fit for angels was more likely to result in blisters than salvation. Yet even poverty didn't excuse filth. Reformers visiting working-class homes often wrote scathing reports about moral decline disguised as dust. Charitable ladies would descend upon slums, armed with soap, tracts, and judgment, insisting that a clean hearth could redeem the soul. These sanitary missionaries, as they were sometimes called, turned washing into a moral conversion ritual. The message was clear. Virtue was visible, preferably in polished copper and bleached cotton. Advertisements reinforced this ideal with ruthless precision. Soap manufacturers portrayed women as domestic heroines, single-handedly defending civilization from grime. One Sunlight soap poster showed a glowing mother surrounded by radiant children, declaring, "Where cleanliness reigns, happiness abides." The implication was unavoidable. If your home wasn't spotless, perhaps your marriage wasn't either. Hygiene had become both a business and a belief system, with women as its loyal clergy. Even literature got in on the act. Victorian novels idealised the spotless home and its tireless mistress. Writers like Charles Dickens and Elizabeth Gaskell filled their pages with good women who polished their virtue as faithfully as their furniture. The dirty woman, meanwhile, became a stock villain, chaotic, lazy, and usually doomed. In fiction, as in life, a clean floor was a moral compass. Some women, however, began to see through the soapsud sermon. By the late 19th century, early feminists started pointing out that the cult of cleanliness was also a tool of control. Writers like Flora Tristan and Charlotte Perkins Gilman argued that domestic purity kept women trapped in unpaid servitude. "We polish our chains," Gilman wrote, "and call it domestic virtue." Even as the sanitation movement expanded public health, it reinforced private confinement, turning women into moral janitors of empire. The irony was inescapable. Men built the pipes, engineers designed the systems, and politicians passed the acts, but women were the ones expected to keep it all running. Every smudge was a failure, every speck of dust a stain on the soul. Cleanliness became both an expectation and a punishment. By the dawn of the 20th century, the gleaming Victorian home had become a shrine to invisible labour, a place where women worked endlessly to maintain the illusion of effortless purity. The home might have looked spotless, but beneath the polished floorboards the pressure was immense. The good news, the drains worked. The bad news, so did the women. Tile, porcelain and ventilation redesigned the home as a temple of hygiene. Nothing says luxury like a bathroom you can actually stand to enter. By the final decades of the Victorian era, cleanliness had conquered not only minds but masonry. Sanitation was no longer confined to sewers or moral sermons. It had seeped into the very architecture of daily life. Homes were redesigned, materials reimagined, and aesthetics redefined in the name of hygiene. The house itself became an instrument of health, and in true Victorian style, it made sure everyone knew it. If the medieval home was built for warmth and the Georgian home for elegance, the late Victorian home was built for washing. Every beam, tile and window had to declare, "I am sanitary." It was the architectural embodiment of progress, part hospital, part temple, and part social performance. The domestic revolution that began with drains and soap ended with design, where form followed function and both smelled faintly of disinfectant. The transformation began with materials. Gone were the heavy draperies, dusty carpets, and ornate wooden mouldings that had once trapped soot and germs like decorative petri dishes. In their place came polished surfaces, glazed tiles, enamel paint, glass panels, and the true symbol of sanitary chic, white porcelain. The Victorians didn't just want clean homes, they wanted homes that looked clean at all times. White reflected purity and conveniently made it impossible to hide dirt. Nothing whispered moral superiority like a floor that tattled on your housekeeping. Bathrooms became the centerpieces of this new aesthetic. Once relegated to the fringes of architecture, or worse, outdoors, the bathroom was now a domestic cathedral to cleanliness. Its arrival inside the home marked a triumph of engineering, plumbing, and social ambition. No longer a dark little chamber of shame, it became a showroom of progress. Designers embraced polished nickel, marble countertops, and gleaming ceramic fixtures that could have doubled as laboratory equipment. Even the humble bathtub was elevated to a work of art, freestanding, claw-footed, and ready to host both moral reflection and mild scalding. And then came the tiles. Nothing captured the spirit of Victorian hygiene quite like a tiled wall. Imported from Holland, crafted in Staffordshire, or custom-made by companies like Minton & Company, tiles became both decoration and defence mechanism. Their smooth, wipeable surfaces made them perfect for repelling moisture, and more importantly, blame. Kitchens, bathrooms, and even hallways gleamed like antiseptic galleries. Colour schemes favoured soft blues, greens, and whites, the hues of air, light, and purity. Dirt, the eternal enemy, had nowhere to hide. Ventilation was another architectural obsession. Reformers argued that bad air was the silent killer of the working class. So architects responded by filling homes with windows, transoms, and cleverly disguised vents. Manuals like The Healthy Dwelling instructed builders to design with the lungs in mind. Houses sprouted ventilated roofs, air grills, and chimney flues that doubled as early air purifiers. The more openings, the better, even if British weather ensured most were slammed shut 9 months of the year. Still, the intention mattered. A draught was now a sign of moral as well as physical health. The kitchen too underwent a metamorphosis. No longer a smoky cave of domestic drudgery, it became a place of science, the engine room of the clean home. Iron ranges replaced open fires, ceramic sinks gleamed under filtered sunlight, and polished brass taps delivered running water on command, assuming the pipes behaved. Even the layout became more logical, guided by the emerging field of domestic efficiency. A well-planned kitchen, reformers said, reflected an efficient mind. The Victorian housewife, armed with both soap and spatial awareness, could now clean, cook, and command with industrial precision. Upstairs, bedrooms shed their clutter in favour of sparse simplicity. Heavy curtains were banished, lace was disinfected. Air your sheets daily, instructed domestic manuals, for dust is the enemy of sleep and soul alike. The morning ritual of throwing open the windows became both health practice and moral display. Servants might mutter about freezing draughts, but the lady of the house would beam with virtue as the London fog rolled politely in. Public architecture followed suit. Schools, hospitals, and railway stations adopted the same principles. Ventilation, washable surfaces, and light, lots of light. Sanitation had become a design language, and cities themselves began to reflect it. Public baths glowed with glazed tile, and hospitals looked more like art galleries than places of sickness. Even prisons got makeovers, their bright white corridors a grim reminder that cleanliness did not necessarily equal comfort. This architectural cleanliness wasn't just about hygiene, it was about control. The home became a moral machine, a place where physical purity reinforced social hierarchy. Only those who could afford the latest plumbing and spotless finishes could live up to the new ideal of domestic virtue. Architects, moralists, and advertisers all agreed. A respectable home was one that could be scrubbed to within an inch of its life. But not everyone adored the aesthetic. Critics complained that sanitary design made houses feel cold, clinical, even inhuman. The warmth of Georgian interiors gave way to something more austere. Visitors joked that Victorian bathrooms looked like operating theatres, and in fairness, many shared the same supplier. Yet the movement endured, precisely because it aligned with the national mood, order, progress, and the illusion of moral clarity. As the 20th century loomed, the architecture of cleanliness became the architecture of modernity. The tiled bathroom evolved into the Art Deco washroom. The ventilated parlour became the open-plan living room. The principles remained the same: smooth surfaces, visible hygiene, and the quiet hum of sanitation behind the walls. The Victorians had turned cleanliness into culture, and culture into construction. The good news? The modern home was now a triumph of beauty and bacteria control. The bad news? You could never quite relax. There was always a smudge somewhere, quietly judging you. Pasteur and Koch's germ theory ended the reign of miasma and started modern medicine. Turns out the nose was not a scientific instrument after all. For centuries, humanity had trusted its nostrils more than its microscopes. If it smelled bad, it must be deadly. If it smelled fine, it was probably safe. The Victorians built entire empires of policy, plumbing, and perfume around that assumption. Then, in the mid to late 19th century, science arrived like an uninvited guest at a very fragrant dinner party and politely announced, "Actually, you've been blaming the wrong culprit." The idea that diseases were caused by invisible living organisms, germs, didn't emerge overnight. It was the product of decades of experiments, fierce debate, and a few brave souls willing to stare at disgusting things through primitive microscopes. The revolution began in laboratories, far from parliament and perfumeries, where a handful of scientists were busy proving that filth was not merely offensive, it was alive. Enter Louis Pasteur, the French chemist who became the arch-nemesis of bad air. In the 1850s, while the British were still obsessing over miasmas, Pasteur began studying fermentation and spoilage. He proved that microorganisms, not mysterious vapours, caused food and drink to rot. His famous experiment, sealing broth in flasks with curved necks, showed that when no airborne particles could enter, no life appeared. Pasteur's conclusion was shocking. Spontaneous generation was a myth. Life came only from life. In short, your milk didn't curdle because of unwholesome atmosphere. It curdled because bacteria were throwing a microscopic party inside it. Soon, Pasteur turned his attention to disease itself. He discovered that specific microbes caused specific illnesses, the cornerstone of germ theory. Chicken cholera, anthrax, rabies, each had its microbial villain. By isolating and weakening these microbes, Pasteur developed vaccines, transforming preventive medicine from folk superstition into laboratory precision. His work didn't just save lives, it completely rewrote humanity's understanding of health. Suddenly, cleanliness wasn't just moral, it was microbiological. Across the border in Germany, Robert Koch took the theory and gave it teeth. While Pasteur was the showman of science, Koch was its accountant, meticulous, methodical, and terrifyingly thorough. In the 1870s and 1880s, he identified the bacteria responsible for anthrax, tuberculosis, and cholera. Using innovative staining techniques and petri dishes named for his assistant Julius Petri, he made germs visible, tangible proof that disease was not a curse or a spell but an invasion. Koch even devised a set of rules, Koch's postulates, outlining how to prove a microorganism caused a specific disease. For the first time, medicine had an instruction manual. The impact was seismic. The world of vapours, humours, and foul airs collapsed almost overnight. Doctors who once prescribed fresh breezes and vinegar compresses were now boiling their instruments and washing their hands. The word antiseptic became fashionable, thanks to Joseph Lister, a Scottish surgeon inspired by Pasteur's findings. Lister began spraying carbolic acid during operations to kill airborne microbes. Patients stopped dying of gangrene. Surgery, once a spectator sport with a body count, became a profession with standards. The ripple effects reached every corner of Victorian life. Hospitals, once terrifying infection factories, began introducing sterilisation procedures. Nurses, following the pioneering example of Florence Nightingale, learned that cleanliness wasn't just moral symbolism but literal survival. Nightingale's earlier insistence on ventilation, fresh air and scrubbing now found scientific validation. Her famous line, "The first requirement in a hospital is that it should do the sick no harm," finally had microbial evidence behind it. Public health policy transformed too. The sanitation movement, which had once relied on the intuition of smell, gained scientific precision. Inspectors could now identify pathogens in water rather than just complaining about its odour. Laboratory analysis replaced the moral sermon. Water purification, pasteurisation, and vaccination campaigns turned cities into testing grounds for this new hygienic order. Suddenly, the fight against disease wasn't about chasing smells, it was about tracking invisible armies. Of course, the transition wasn't smooth. Old habits die hard, and Victorian noses were stubbornly opinionated. Many doctors clung to miasma theory well into the 1880s, insisting that foul odours weakened the constitution and that germs were merely opportunists. In truth, both camps had a point. Bad sanitation and bad air still correlated with illness, just not for the reasons everyone thought. The great irony was that even when the Victorians were wrong, their obsession with cleanliness kept them accidentally right. Meanwhile, the general public found germ theory both thrilling and terrifying. Newspapers printed lurid sketches of magnified microbes, labelling them the new enemies of man. Pamphlets warned that bacteria lurked on doorknobs, coins and kisses. A new anxiety was born, germophobia, and Victorians began disinfecting everything from furniture to friendship. Soap sales soared again, proving that moral panic and marketing have always gone hand in hand. By the turn of the 20th century, germ theory had completely reshaped medicine, sanitation, and daily life. Pasteur's and Koch's discoveries paved the way for modern bacteriology, antiseptics, and eventually antibiotics. The laboratory replaced the pulpit as the source of health doctrine. Even architecture and fashion adapted, lighter fabrics, more washable interiors, and less clutter, all in the name of microbial warfare. The house that once displayed moral virtue through polish now displayed scientific virtue through hygiene. And yet, the victory of science over superstition came with an almost poetic irony. For centuries, humanity had fought imaginary vapours. Now it had found the real enemy, and it was smaller, stealthier, and far harder to eradicate. Germ theory didn't end the war on filth. It simply shrunk the battlefield. The good news? Medicine had finally caught up with logic. The bad news? Everyone now lived in a permanent state of microscopic paranoia. Cleanliness divided society. The poor were blamed for dirt while the rich outsourced theirs. If you were poor, you were dirty. If you were rich, you had rustic charm. For all its progress, Victorian sanitation was never just about health. It was about hierarchy. The ages that invented modern cleanliness also perfected class-based hygiene. To be clean wasn't simply a matter of soap and drains. It was a mark of moral worth and social rank. The upper classes scrubbed for respectability, the middle classes scrubbed for survival, and the working poor were expected to scrub with resources they didn't have. Dirt in Victorian Britain was destiny. The contradiction was staggering. This was a society that preached cleanliness is next to godliness, but forgot to mention that God apparently charged by the gallon. Water cost money. Soap cost money. Coal to heat bath water cost a lot of money. For the poor living in cramped tenements, hygiene wasn't a moral failing, it was an economic impossibility. Many homes had no running water, no drainage, and no ventilation beyond what the rats could gnaw open. Yet reformers continued to moralise about filth as if poverty were a hobby. Middle and upper class observers toured slums with handkerchiefs pressed dramatically to their noses, writing reports about degraded habits and domestic neglect. They rarely mentioned that 20 people might share a single outdoor tap, or that soap was taxed until 1853. Instead, they concluded that the poor were dirty because they were lazy. It was social Darwinism with a whiff of disinfectant. Meanwhile, the wealthy rebranded their own mess as aesthetic. Country estates, for example, were full of healthy earthiness. Muddy boots and manure-scented air were romantic signs of rural vigour, not unhygienic conditions. Aristocrats posed for portraits in natural outdoor settings, while lecturing the urban poor about the moral dangers of grime. If a working man smelled of sweat, he was filthy. If a landowner did, he was robust. The double standard could have been bottled and sold as eau de hypocrisy. The industrial middle class occupied an awkward in-between. They had the income to pursue cleanliness, but lived close enough to poverty to fear contamination, physical and social alike. Their homes became fortresses of hygiene, immaculate to the point of exhaustion. A spotless doorstep, polished silver, and regularly whitewashed walls were declarations of status. To keep clean was to keep climbing. To fall into filth was to slide back into the abyss of the unrespectable. Cleanliness for the Victorians was social insurance. But even as sanitation improved, the labour of cleanliness fell hardest on those at the bottom. Working-class women, both as housewives and domestic servants, carried the burden of Britain's hygienic revolution. While reformers praised the shining parlours of respectable homes, few acknowledged the army of maids who scrubbed them into submission. These women lived in the kitchens, cellars and sculleries where sanitary ideals meant 14-hour shifts, cracked hands and chemical burns. They polished other people's virtue while society quietly looked away. And then there were the night soil men, the unsung and unwashed heroes of urban sanitation. Long after London installed its grand sewers, rural towns and poorer districts still relied on manual waste collection. Under the cover of darkness, these labourers shovelled and hauled human excrement from cesspits, earning meagre pay for society's dirtiest work. Their job was essential, but their existence was despised. They were ghosts of filth, tolerated, pitied, but never invited to the dinner table. Public baths and washhouses, as noble as they were, couldn't bridge the divide. Middle-class reformers built them as uplifting spaces for the poor, but they also served as subtle lectures in morality. Posters reminded bathers to bathe decently and avoid conversation. In these tiled temples of respectability, cleanliness was both a blessing and a behavioural test. Soap came with supervision. The message was clear. You could wash your body, but you'd better wash your manners too. Even charity smelled of condescension. Philanthropic organisations distributed soap and clothing to the needy, always accompanied by stern advice on proper living. Poor mothers were told to scrub more, cook better, and raise cleaner children, as if squalor were a lifestyle choice. Meanwhile, the wealthy escaped to seaside resorts for restorative air baths, sipping mineral water between lectures on discipline and self-control, and the Victorians had turned cleanliness into an instrument of guilt. Yet ironically, the dirtiest work made the cleanest cities. The industrial poor were the ones who built the sewers, emptied the drains and cleaned the very streets the upper classes walked upon. The same people labelled as unsanitary were the ones maintaining sanitation. Even their neighbourhoods, ridiculed for being filthy, often sat downstream, literally and figuratively, from the pollution of factories owned by their social betters. The rich created the dirt, the poor lived in it, and everyone pretended it was the poor's fault. Art and literature captured the hypocrisy. Charles Dickens's novels teemed with grime, not just as scenery but as social metaphor, the physical manifestation of inequality. Dirt, in Dickens, was never just mud, it was injustice that stuck to your boots. Social reformers borrowed his imagery, using dirt as the visual shorthand for poverty. Yet while they lamented the slums, they still drew a firm line between sympathy and equality. One could pity the poor without ever touching them. By the turn of the 20th century, Britain had transformed itself into a world leader in sanitation, but it remained divided by cleanliness. Working-class districts still battled over crowding and pollution, while affluent neighbourhoods gleamed with imported marble bathrooms and fresh flowers. The poor were told to scrub harder. The rich hired someone else to do it. Cleanliness was civilization, and civilization had a hierarchy. The good news, Britain finally learned that filth was a public problem. The bad news, still decided it was the poor's private fault. Late Victorians took hygiene to extremes, inventing the first generation of germophobes. They fought filth so hard they started sterilising their personalities. By the end of the 19th century, Britain had scrubbed, polished, drained, and disinfected itself into an entirely new age. The cities sparkled, the drains gurgled obediently, and the air smelled faintly of soap and smugness. The Great War against filth had been won, but the victors soon discovered an uncomfortable truth. Once you defeat dirt, you start imagining it everywhere. The late Victorians didn't just value cleanliness, they worshipped it. Hygiene had gone from health habit to national obsession, a moral, scientific and psychological fixation. Gone were the days of merely cleaning your house. Now you had to purify your soul, your cutlery, your curtains, and possibly your cat. The nation that once tolerated open cesspits now panicked at the sight of a smudge. Cleanliness had become not a defence against disease, but a lifestyle, a virtue, and increasingly an anxiety disorder. This shift was driven partly by science and partly by marketing genius. Germ theory, that dazzling new revelation of invisible life, had terrified people. Newspapers printed terrifying illustrations of magnified bacteria shaped like tiny monsters. Pamphlets screamed about the unseen assassins in your milk, or the hidden dangers of the dining table. Suddenly, every object in the home seemed to harbour microscopic treachery. The Victorians, who had once feared bad smells, now feared invisible enemies on their teaspoons, and the companies, bless them, saw opportunity. By the 1880s and 1890s, a new industry had emerged: domestic disinfection. Products like carbolic soap, Lysol, then marketed as a vaginal cleanser for reasons best left in history, and antiseptic powders promised to slay germs with chemical vengeance. Advertisements depicted happy housewives holding bottles of disinfectant like holy relics, smiling serenely at their conquered bacteria. The subtext was simple. If you weren't disinfecting, you were basically harbouring plague rats. The middle-class home became a laboratory of purification. Every surface glistened. Every object was wiped, aired or boiled. Bedding was sun-dried, silver was sterilised, and even letters were ironed to kill possible contagion. The domestic servant became a kind of germ soldier, battling invisible foes with mops and moral fortitude. Manuals such as the Sanitary Housekeeper or Health and Home instructed readers to clean everything that touches breath or food, which in practice meant everything. Even architecture began to reflect the national neurosis. The plush velvet and heavy drapery of mid-century decor, once considered luxurious, were now condemned as dust traps. The modern home had to be smooth, wipeable, and above all white. White tiles, white walls, white porcelain, not just for beauty but for surveillance. Dirt couldn't hide on white. If you could see it, you could kill it. The result was the early aesthetic of the modern bathroom, sterile, gleaming, and faintly intimidating. Cleanliness became social theatre. Guests no longer judged homes solely by their furniture, but by the freshness of the air and the absence of dust. A smudge on a doorknob was practically a moral scandal. Some hostesses even sprayed carbolic acid mist before entertaining visitors, a fine way to disinfect the room and ensure nobody stayed too long. Soap advertisements showed spotless families framed in halos of steam, suggesting that moral worth could be measured in suds. But beneath the lavender and Lysol, something deeper was stirring. Fear. Germs had replaced sin as the great invisible threat, and the result was a generation of anxious hand washers. Doctors reported an increase in neurasthenia, a catch-all term for nervous exhaustion that often described upper-class women driven to despair by household hygiene. Some were said to suffer soap mania, washing their hands dozens of times a day. Others refused to shake hands entirely, preferring the hygienic nod. Social etiquette, once ruled by the manners, was now ruled by microbes. Men were not immune either. Public health propaganda had convinced Victorians that hygiene equaled strength, so even masculinity became tied to soap. Advertisers depicted rugged sailors and athletes proudly lathering up, declaring, "The clean man is the strong man." Meanwhile, anyone who wasn't immaculately scrubbed risked being labelled unfit, untrustworthy, or, the ultimate insult, un-English. The empire, after all, was built on cleanliness and conquest. Its citizens were expected to embody both. Schools joined the crusade, teaching hygiene as moral education. Children were lectured on the dangers of dirty fingernails and unbrushed teeth. Teachers inspected hands before lunch and rewarded the cleanest desks with prizes. Health songs were introduced, with lyrics like, "Wash your hands before your tea, for germs are things you cannot see." It was adorable, alarming, and deeply Victorian. And as with all moral crusades, hypocrisy lingered beneath the soap bubbles. The wealthy could afford spotless homes, disinfected linens, and indoor plumbing. The working poor, still crammed into sooty neighbourhoods, were chastised for not being hygienic enough. The cult of cleanliness had simply replaced class prejudice with a fresher scent. Reformers still visited slums, armed with moral superiority and buckets, declaring we must teach them to live cleanly, as though germs respected bank balances. Yet there were moments of brilliance in the madness. The obsession with hygiene spurred advances in public health infrastructure. Sterilised hospitals, clean water systems, food safety regulations, and the first municipal garbage collections. Out of anxiety came innovation. The Victorians might have been overzealous, but they built the hygienic foundation of the modern world. Still, one couldn't help but feel sorry for them. A society that had once celebrated its triumph over filth was now terrified of fingerprints. The drawing room had become a battlefield of disinfectant. Friendship itself was filtered through fear of contagion. In trying to sanitize their world, the Victorians had accidentally sterilised joy. The good news, they gave us modern hygiene, clean water and germ theory in action. The bad news, they also gave us the first person to say, "I'd love to come, but I just disinfected the house." The Victorian war on waste built modern cities, medicine, and our uneasy obsession with hygiene. They conquered filth so we could complain about recycling bins. When the 19th century finally exhaled a cleaner, quieter, and smelling faintly of carbolic acid, it left behind more than a few polished brass taps. The Victorian Sanitation revolution had transformed the way humans lived, built, and thought. What began as a desperate battle against disease became the blueprint for the modern world. The way we plan cities, manage health, and even judge one another's cleanliness. Their obsession outlived them, and arguably still rules us. It's hard to overstate what the Victorians achieved. Before their great experiment, cities were cesspits of chaos. Streets doubled as drains, rivers carried death, and disease spread faster than gossip at a garden party. By the dawn of the 20th century, London, Manchester, and Birmingham had become marvels of sanitation engineering. Underground sewer systems, water purification plants, and organised waste collection turned once lethal cities into engines of global progress. It wasn't glamorous work, and nobody built monuments to sewage, but these projects did more for humanity's survival than all the royal palaces combined. The result was a quiet revolution in public health. Life expectancy rose, epidemics of cholera, typhoid, and dysentery declined. Infant mortality plummeted. People began to see the link between environment and health as a matter of fact rather than faith. For the first time, the state had proven that large-scale intervention, drains, waterworks, inspection laws could literally save lives. Governments worldwide took notes. From Paris to New York, from Bombay to Buenos Aires, city planners began copying the British formula. Pave it, pipe it, police it. Civilization had found its infrastructure. The ripple effects went far beyond plumbing. Modern medicine as we know it was born from the same logic of hygiene. The Victorians' mania for cleanliness led to antiseptic surgery, germ theory, hospital sterilisation, and eventually antibiotics. The notion that prevention was better than cure became foundational to medical science. The doctor of 1900 was no longer a man with a leech and a prayer. He was a professional in a white coat, armed with disinfectant, data, and dazzling self-confidence. The modern hospital, bright, sterile, and terrifyingly organised, was a direct descendant of the Victorian sewer. Even our cities still bear their imprint. The idea that urban life could be designed, that cities could be planned rather than merely endured, was a Victorian innovation. The wide boulevards, green parks, and public squares we now take for granted were born out of sanitary necessity. The Victorians didn't build beauty for beauty's sake, they built beauty to help you breathe. Modern zoning laws, building codes, and environmental health departments all trace their lineage back to those first weary inspectors who measured the slope of drains under candlelight. Their influence crept into culture too. The link between cleanliness and morality, once just a sermon topic, became a social reflex. Clean became synonymous with good and dirty with bad. That linguistic inheritance remains stubbornly alive. We still say clean money, clean living, clean energy, and dirty politics. Even when we're not talking about soap, we're talking about its ghost. The Victorians didn't just wash their hands, they washed our vocabulary. But the Victorian legacy was never entirely wholesome. For all their progress, they also built the foundations of our modern hygiene anxiety. They taught us that the world is full of invisible threats, first miasmas, then microbes, and that salvation lies in perpetual vigilance. Every age since has followed their example with its own flavour of fear. The 20th century had germ warfare and food safety. The 21st has antibacterial everything. Somewhere in heaven, Edwin Chadwick is probably smiling smugly every time someone sanitizes their hands twice in a row. The commercialization of cleanliness, another Victorian invention, also never ended. Those cheerful Pears soap ads became the ancestors of every detergent, deodorant, and clean beauty campaign we see today. Hygiene became capitalism's favourite virtue. Want to sell something? Convince people that not buying it makes them unclean. Whether it's hand wash or bottled water, the formula hasn't changed in 150 years. Purity equals status, and there's always room for one more disinfectant. And yet, for all their eccentricities and hypocrisies, the Victorians left the world undeniably better. They forced governments to take responsibility for health. They professionalised engineering and medicine. They made public works truly public. They gave cities lungs, water systems, and consciences. Without them, the modern metropolis would still be a maze of stink and sickness, a glittering corpse rather than a living organism. Their ideas also laid the groundwork for the environmental movement. The same sanitary logic that cleaned rivers of waste eventually inspired efforts to protect them from industrial pollution. The Victorians may not have used the word sustainability, but they pioneered its ancestors. Conservation, waste management, and the belief that human progress required stewardship. In a way, every recycling bin, water treatment plant, and environmental regulation is a descendant of the same impulse that once drove Londoners to flee from the great stink. Of course, they also passed down their contradictions. The empire that exported plumbing also exported pollution. The society that preached cleanliness outsourced its dirt to colonies, to servants, to the working poor. The Victorians proved that you can have immaculate streets and dirty politics at the same time. And perhaps that's the truest legacy of all, the modern world's uneasy relationship with its own waste, physical, moral, and industrial. Today we flush toilets without thinking, drink from tap water cleaner than most medieval wells, and live in cities that owe their very survival to Victorian infrastructure. Yet we still wrestle with the same questions they did. How much cleanliness is enough? Who pays for it? And what happens when the pursuit of purity turns obsessive? The good news The Victorians built the systems that keep us alive. The bad news, they also built the anxiety that keeps us scrubbing. Their sewers became our cities, their soap became our psychology, and their war on filth, equal parts brilliance and neurosis, never truly ended. We just gave it new names: progress, wellness, and eco-friendly bleach. So next time you flush a toilet, turn on a tap, or grumble about the smell of the garbage truck outside, remember, you're living in the empire the Victorians built. They cleaned so we could complain. They sanitized so we could survive. And somewhere deep beneath the pavement, Joseph Bazalgette's brick tunnels still hum quietly in triumph, proof that even civilization's dirtiest work can leave behind a spotless legacy.